Hello, everybody, and welcome to another fantastic installment of Chance Paladin Reads His Books. This was narrated in front of a live streaming audience, and this is book number 14, which I should have said first, which is called, the book's called Six Sands. So, none of this in the book should be considered legal, medical, dental, vision, or any kind of virological advice. Consult professionals. Okay. All rights reserved. No portion of this book may be reproduced in any form without permission from the author except as permitted by U.S. copyright law. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents are all either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead or actual events is purely coincidental. In memory of Leo. Too soon, man. Too soon. Content advisory is as follows. I write post-apocalypse books, therefore, portions of these stories are intended for mature audiences. There's about as much romance as you would expect in a typical post-apocalypse scenario. Explicit sexual acts were included are germane to the story, not intended to be gratuitous or fetishized. There isn't any really hard swearing worse than what you'd hear on cable. There's a moderate range of violence as would be expected in a post-apocalypse story. However, the suffering aspects are not deliberately glamorized or embellished upon. Please read responsibly. Forward. People wanted us to die. There was no question. We didn't want them to die. We just wanted them to go away. They wouldn't go, though. So we left, and they followed. We came back from time to time to remind them that we hadn't left for good. That they were left alone in their little playground by choice. They followed us to try to remind us that they weren't scared and meddled in matters that had no impact on them while forcing our relevant law on us. We followed them to remind them that the law worked both ways. Where we showed restraint, they showed ruthlessness. Where we showed compassion, they showed hesitation. There were no winners or losers, though, and the sickest thing of all was their cheering when our side started dying. Just trying to live out the last throes of our existence before the end began. Chapter 1. The End. It was hot and cold at the same time in the high deserts, somewhere in the middle of eastern Washington, eastern Oregon, Idaho, Utah, West Montana, and North Nevada. The planet was trying to figure out what temperature it was supposed to be as the sun hung low in the sky. Our hero, standing stoic, with a long shadow overlooking his humble homestead, as a tumbleweed went to find other tumbleweeds to congregate with for the inevitable cold night. A tire inexplicably rolled the other direction. The middle-aged man with a handlebar beard and cowboy hat raised an eyebrow at the tire, hands on his 2 6-shooters. He knew better than to shoot at innocent tires, though, and nodded at the tire as it rolled by. He looked both directions on his property with no real sense of where the tire had come from, and shrugged. I could really go for some Red Dead Robins right now, referring to his old favorite diner. He spoke out to nobody as if it was a normal conversation with no real beginning or end. Nobody responded, of course. There was nobody there. There was nothing left to do on the homestead as the sun began to set. The tire trudged off into the distance, wherever it was that tires went. A tumbleweed smacked into his leg as if he wasn't supposed to be there. The thought crossed his mind to kick the tumbleweed, but decided instead to get out of its way. The tumbleweed patiently waited, and upon the obstacle being seemingly gone, the tumbleweed continued its path to wherever it was tumbleweeds went. The man tried to remember his name, it being long lost in the desert. Rico. Maybe that was it. He shrugged. One of these days he would remember positively. His state identification was reduced to a melted char in his wallet, burnt up in a fire with everything else he'd known except his 2 6s, of course. Revolvers that had been passed down by his father and his father before him. Ornate decorations covered the cobalt steel with nickel-plated grips, identifying the duo as Justice and Liberty. Water trickled around his modest few groupings of what little plant life would grow in the arid highlands. He'd been lucky enough to find a well and cap it at just the right pressure a long time ago. The tiny creek meandered and snaked around a bit before passing through a few collection pits dug into the ground for emergency overflow and capture. Then before the water leaked everywhere, it naturally overflowed back into a seemingly bottomless hole in the ground to find the underground creek again. Why or how had he been spared the night of the fire? His charred ID reminded him of. The details were hazy. He wasn't sure exactly what happened. There must have been a fight, though, because he was still bruised and missing some teeth. Multiple burn marks and blisters still stung him around his body. All he remembered was a road, darkness, and a fire, and passing out. Someone died. It should have been him, but it wasn't. Joe touched his mouth and felt the few teeth missing, trying to remember. It hurt to try to remember. Chapter 2, Homecoming. A weekish earlier, hundreds of miles away. Night of the collapse. Beatings, fire, teeth. It had been a long day and a longer night. After the wreck and fight, they had to throw one of the assailants, relational to their friend's physical size, into a burning wrecked semi-truck. With the help of a multi-tool and one of the assailant's own hammers, some ruthless and crude dentistry was done to remove their teeth. Those teeth were tossed off the cliff across the road and replaced with their friend's teeth, beat loose from the violence, and thrown in the burning truck with the assailant. The wreck was in the middle of nowhere, and rescue wouldn't be there for hours. Even in the best circumstances, the body would be unrecognizable, and his teeth would seal the story. The group pulled his limp, bruised, and burned body into their vehicle and drove all night. They had learned a little first aid from a friend and got him stabilized. They'd been driving around all day, beating the living hell out of these punks after they were raiding all the abandoned stores due to a huge storm. Earlier, they'd saved a young trucker gal at a grocery store and had been saving people and beating up these ninja wannabes all day. It seemed only fitting that they had saved another trucker as they rounded out their night. It was time to get out, though, they knew, and they were taking this guy with them. They drove for hours, Joe coming in and out of consciousness. He knew he was with friends, but wasn't completely aware of who they were or why he was there. He was supposed to be driving his truck, wasn't he? He would never intentionally leave his truck, right? For some reason he felt like it didn't matter anymore, but couldn't remember why. All Joe knew was that he was on another road trip with his buddies like he had been so many times before. This didn't feel like the I-5 belt, though. This felt like something else, like a gradual rise in altitude. It didn't matter, though. He was with his friends. One patted him on the shoulders. They drove through the night. A few glimpses outside as they seemed to pass through a few towns, but the power didn't seem to be on. The power was supposed to be on in the towns, wasn't it? His friend didn't stop at any of those towns. They kept going through the silent night as if hell was on their heels. It seemed dark for so long, those winter months having seamlessly endless nights. Eventually, what seemed like hours later, with the driver toggling his brights on and off as applicable to make sure they didn't hit a deer, while not blinding other drivers, they came upon a town with lights on. Joe tried to talk but couldn't. One patted him on the shoulder and told him to rest, that he was safe. Joe went back to sleep, hoping they got him some snacks. He was very hungry, then fell back asleep. He was so tired for some reason, drowsy, fatigued, weak. While he was asleep, there was a faint memory of maybe someone slipping something in his drink at a rest stop, but it was fuzzy. One of the guys stayed with him in the van as the rest piled into the 24-hour drugstore. They went and got some pain medications and burn cream, and were overall very respectful to the clerk. She was a cute young girl with white hair and a pale face. They had caught her taking her meds when they walked in, much to their amusement. They couldn't catch her name on her name tag, but it looked like a Kim. She nervously explained they were specifically designed around her chemicals and that nobody else should take them because they were designed just for people like her. The boys nodded and smiled with a thumbs up, and it made her feel at ease, as if mid-sentence or thought she abruptly went back to work, packing their purchases up The boys looked at each other and tipped her $100 in 20s, with the intent that she buy some spare food and supplies for herself before she ended her shift. She absent-mindedly took the folded bills and stuffed them in a tiny pocket of her tight jeans, as if it was routine. As if continuing a conversation in her head, she asked if something was wrong, and had noticed a bunch of TV channels weren't working before she came to work. She figured the channels were located closer to the storm, and that the storm would likely knock them out. The boys said they didn't know for sure, but that it might be best to stay with some friends for a while until everything got sorted out. They couldn't tell if she was listening anymore, as she was trying to help someone else, so they shrugged. A pink smartphone as wide as her pocket poked out 2/3 of the way of her back pocket, the pocket barely securing the phone in. A green light blinking, identifying it still had a cell phone signal. She'd taken the tip money and they'd already paid, so they wrote her a note and left it on a register so she could remember. She seemed nice and was cute, so it helped them to know that she'd be okay in the first store in 100 miles that actually had electricity and cell. It wouldn't take people too long to find out the store they weren't already rallying to secure what they had. It wouldn't take people too long to find the store if they weren't already rallying to secure what they had for the locals. Hopefully she would get off shift before things got bad and be able to lay low. They grabbed all their snacks, meds, and other provisions and went on their way. As they drove along, the passenger up front messed with the vehicle radio while trying to find a radio in either AM or FM that had news. Everything prior to this point had been some kind of bogus emergency loop that the boys knew was propaganda to lure them back into the city. There had been looting systematically after every single storm for a year or so they liked to go out and thrash the looters. They knew this one was different, though. The power hadn't come back on and the cops weren't showing up. The initial trash they were fighting was the bargain bin. By the end of the day, there were more militant separatists popping up, and it wasn't safe without their more well-armed, sarcastically, with love and respect, denoted as militia counterparts. Earlier in the night, on their way out of the state to the biggest stronghold and concentration of patriots in the western U.S., they had made one last stop at a truck stop. It was the final rally point they'd all talked about before one last long drive. It had tons of fuel and food, and usually like-minded people. Not this time, though. There'd been some punks as well. They looked like they were hunting someone, so the boys stayed to watch, since they weren't the more militant type to act without provocation. The boys saw the punks put something in a guy's that they were messing with's drink. One had distracted him while the other slipped something in the cup of coffee. This was typically a rowdy truck stop, so it wasn't unusual for there to be scuffles and nobody intervening. One of the boys was about to get up to say something, concerned it was a roofie or some sort of sleeping pill memory wipe combo, when he shoved the punks off and left with his coffee. If the punks had followed, the boys would have pursued, but they didn't. They instead stopped and sat down and laughed like it was some part of a twisted plan. One of the boys recognized the guy getting bullied as one of their collective friends. The boys knew better than to split up, but couldn't decide whether to try to meet up with him or deal with the punks. The boys' food arrived, and they asked for their huge orders to go, so they could at least have options. They had ordered a ton of food, and they were flush with probably useless paper currency from their day of thrashing punks that had robbed so many places post-storm. The cash had been handy in the past between banking system outages, as cards were useless without electricity, but this time felt different. The banks had been destroyed as well, and they had driven past many ATMs already in pieces. Part of the collapse had seemed to be a deliberate attack on the currency, with much of it being burned instead of stolen, depending on who had initiated the specific deed. The boys had been able to stop a few vandals and held on to the cash like they always did. The further away they drove, though, the more worthless the cash was feeling. They had concluded the unanimous decision to spend it as fast as they could to get as much value as they could. They had found a fuel station operating on generator and had paid an exorbitant amount of money to top off and get enough fuel cans for the drive they knew they had to make. The attendant hadn't known two important things, though. One, that cash was now essentially worthless, and To the outrageous amount he asked for was barely a handful of 3 duffel bags of cash they had amassed from fighting crime that day. The boys would have returned the cash, of course, if society had turned back to normal, but there didn't appear to be any signs of that happening, though, so they decided to redistribute it as they saw fit. Right now, that meant ordering tons of food at the truck stop. Redistributing it capitalist style. Their food came back from the waitress, and she noticed that their friend had left in a hurry without paying his tab for dinner. In the distance out the window at night, they saw a truck head off in the direction they were headed, and they all nodded in inconvenience. The waitress tried to collect from the 4 punks still sitting at his table, but they pretended like they were now going to attack her. Not wanting a scene, the 4 stood up and paid the gal for the 3 sets of meals as they stared the punks down. With a generous tip, she trotted off without another word. The punks recognized the boys and wanted to fight, but one that seemed to be hopped up on prescription amphetamine reminded them of their mission. The other 3 nodded in concert, spiting their pathetic attention span, and bolted. The boys didn't have to think for a second and pursued, only to see the punks flying off in their car the same direction the boys were going anyway. The 4 hopped in the van with their food and hauled off, silently happy the punks hadn't had time to identify their nondescript van and slash its tires. In premeditation. The boys got their van going as fast as it would go in the direction of the punks, following their friend. The boys had to go fast, though, pushing the limits of the van. Having switched from cars to vans midway through this slow collapse due to the safety and security of having more of them in each vehicle, the punks at most could muster 4 to 5 in their tiny underpowered cars. The boys could get as many as 8 or 9 in a van, sometimes more if it was a cargo van with more space and significantly bigger power to weight ratio on the engine. This was a minivan, though. It could comfortably fit 6 big guys, its moderate engine only allowing them to go around 90 miles an hour, exceeding the 85-mile-an-hour speedometer's red glowing range. The van driver's hope was that the little underpowered car they were chasing couldn't go too much faster than them, fully loaded with the 4 punks. It didn't take long, though, in the darkness of the night, between the stretched miles without street lights. There'd been little debate over whether to go on with their headlights set to bright mode or not wanting to survive the whole day only to get plowed by a deer, so the vote was unanimous. The lights would be bright, then not. Then the driver would turn them off completely to freak everyone out. It wasn't a game, though, when they kept their brights on, because at their speed they were easily overrunning their normal strength old headlights the van had. And nobody wanted a 500-pound deer flying through their windshield and out the other end, which would take most of them with it easily, so they drove and drove, trying to estimate the minutes to miles, and within 15 minutes almost flew past their bounty when they saw a horrible wreck. Their friend's truck was on fire, with the stark contrast of a silhouette of black-clad boys stomping someone into the gravel. He was putting up no fight, laying there unconscious. The stomping and beating continued regardless. The van of boys slammed on their brakes, skidding sideways as they hit gravel and almost toppled over. The driver expertly corrected at the last second. The driver had been practicing this move all day and was able to course correct, pulling up alongside the punks, the spinning tires showering the violent mob with shards of gravel still traveling at the skidding tires' speed. The van side door opened as it had all day, unleashing hell upon the kids in the cold and dark night, backlit by a truck nearly engulfed in flames. Current. The sudden burst of noise was startling when the radio actually produced a real voice on the other end that hadn't been pre-recorded and looped bullcrap. The radio host abruptly cut in mid-transition of a loop, mentioning, probably to their producer, something about how they hadn't heard from anyone in the Northwest in a few hours and all power being out. People in Ham had been calling in and reporting mass looting or worse. As the boys drove on for a few more hours, taking care of their buddy in the back, the sun finally started to come up. The news changed from some anarchists burning the city when the power being out to some kind of Bolshevik Revolution 2.0. The boys all silently hoped that their friends got out okay or got to one of their bug-out locations with more heavily armed patriot buddies. There was a quick joke about free helicopter rides, but other than that they remained mostly silent. They'd only been passing through days before a visit, so they didn't exactly live specifically in the Pacific Northwest, but that's where all their friends lived. Hadn't really been uncommon to drive 14 hours each way to see their buddies, but things had never got this crazy before. Their friends had gotten hurt before too, but never this bad. It wouldn't be too much longer now before they would be at their friend's ranch to drop him off. The boys had only been there a few times as a pit stop on the way home, but remember fairly well how to get him there. They'd picked him up prior to some rallies before, and he was on the way. Their friend had a normal place in the city, but this was his escape from it all. They'd take care of him for a while until he was better, then they'd be on their way to check in with their families. Well, some could go back to their families with the van and afterwards come back and check on him. They'd figure out some kind of cadence once he was stable. Chapter 3. The dirt says yes. The van slowed as they pulled into a dirt driveway. The sun was a few hours up into the sky. The night chill was wearing off, but it wouldn't be too warm for the day. The boys were all exhausted, and they all hopped out to their own now sporadic placing of trees. One set the windows to roll down as they all scrambled in their various directions, too exhausted to even make their normal jokes. Van still running, keys in, but windows down so nobody would get ripped on for locking the keys in the van again. The fresh air of the desolate landscape was welcoming and immediately filled the van. Before they could make their way back, their buddy was already inexplicably out and unlocking the heavy gate as a matter of routine. They all arrived back at the gate from their tree break, alarmed, with heavy pits in their stomachs, unsure what to do. He looked at all of them with a blank look, unsure as to why they were so alarmed. The heavy, high-security, weatherproof lock easily unsnapped from using its counterpart key. The boys had admittedly not thought out exactly how they were going to get through prior. The gate was interlocking steel with heavy railroad chains bolted to railroad ties. Ramming it would destroy your vehicle, and there was no way around it that wasn't a tank-proof ditch for miles in each direction. Climbing meant going through spiral concertina wire with barbed wire going through. It had been covered by blackberry bushes years ago that had dug deep and found a stream deep underground via taproot that kept the berry bushes growing to absurd quantities. The gate was now unlocked, though, as if this was a normal routine. The boys stared at their buddy as he completed his routine and held the gate out for them. He bowed down with an arm extending his invitation as they drove through without question, but internally confused. He checked his mailbox and followed them in, knocking to get let back into the van with his mail. One let him in without even thinking, and he jumped in and started going through his mail. Before anyone could say anything as they drove slow to his little humble home, they crashed out before he spoke. "So guys, how'd we do?" They all looked at each other. One spoke again without thinking much. "You, don't remember? How do you feel?" He seemed to skip over checking himself over before thinking. "Yeah, I seem fine. A few less teeth, I guess, but I don't appear to be bleeding, so that's good, right? Hopefully whoever did this fared worse, eh?" He chuckled a little bit, trying to lighten the social atmosphere, but groaned as he put his hand to his ribs. Another spoke. "Yeah, we'll just say the people who did this won't be walking again for a while." He trailed off. "Or ever," another mumbled under his breath, unsure whether to be proud or lament that this had finally gone as far as it did. His buddy was gonna jab him in the ribs for the comment, but everyone's ribs probably hurt from the near solid 16 hours or so of fighting and beatings that they'd been through. The van pulled to a halt in front of their friend's house, and they all got out to canvass the area. Everything appeared fine, and they returned to their friend in the process of unlocking his house. "Let me get everyone something to drink," he said as cheerily as he could muster. He looked at them all, and they looked like hell. They hadn't cleaned up at all the places they'd gone. They were so used to be caked in urine and in contrast milk mixtures for cleaning the chemicals out of their eyes that they would often forget. It hadn't been unusual for them to go hours, faces caked in white, as they would give up cleaning their faces, getting pepper sprayed and bear sprayed so often. The boys started smacking themselves in the head, realizing that they had been going to the truck stop and corner store still caked in various sprays and urine. Most everyone had stopped bringing cleaner with them because until you got rid of your clothes, you weren't going to get rid of most of the odorous and capsicum smell. Ridiculous Scoville ratings, too high for any food to naturally have, going right into your eyes. Burns really bad. You do eventually get used to it, but Having it in your eyes for too long can cause blindness. The casein for milk dissolves the long hydrocarbon tail of capsaicin as it attaches itself all over your face. Sometimes remembering that process was all you had as you ran around screaming blind, trying to not get hit by traffic at night, looking for the medic wagon. Water helps a little, but there'd been a new emergency spray developed that got the burn off almost immediately. There was only a few medics that carried it, though, due to the cost, and the boys almost never had the luxury of running with medics, so they would wash their faces with some form of milk, water, and baby shampoo and keep going. They got used to the smell now, so only in the clean air did they realize how bad they reeked. Man, y'all stink. Let's get inside and get the hot water going in the showers. Not all at once, though. They smirked at him, and they all looked exhausted, not giving him much of any response. He wondered to himself what had happened, but tried to remember, but it hurt. He shrugged. He looked at his mail, and it said to Rico and Frederico. His friends had been calling him Joe, though, but maybe this was his actual name. It was hard to remember because nobody called each other by their real names anymore. Joe, Rico, Frederico, the names revolved in his head like the pistols on his charred belt. His head twitched once at the discrepancy. Frederico. The name seemed to land like a marble on a roulette wheel. He was home. He threw the mail on the table and flicked on the hot water on his charge controller. The load balancer was supposed to be hooked up to the battery's inverter in a wind turbine, but no such luck. He'd unfortunately never had the money to put in the wind turbine after having the concrete pad laid. Instead of the controller defaulted back to his natural gas reservoir buried behind his homestead. The water was immediately started to cycle past pipes getting hot. It produced hot water on the spot for hours. Before long, there were tons of dudes running around the house, snapping each other with clean wet towels and acting weird. Rico grabbed all their rancid clothes and started washing them all in a mop bucket and handmade soap from under the sink. By the time they were all done cleaning up the clothes, would be in the next room on the line and almost dry. It was going to be a hot day, like it was always hot year-round, hot and dry. Not uncomfortable, but a far cry from the rain-infused Pacific forest that they'd been at days before. Rico stopped to focus on the memory for a second, but it hurt, so he stopped. More squishing and the laundry was done and ready for the line. He turned on the range and set out a few cans of long-term storage food. It didn't take long for Rico to clip up all the laundry and come in to throw some corned beef hash mixed with roast beef hash in the hot pan. The range ran off gas, and as efficient as it was, could run years without the tank needing to be refilled. A clean spatula got pulled out of the drawer as he had presumably a million times before, and started chopping and mixing. The guys slowly cycled through the shower, then grabbed plates of the high-protein carb mix as if it was another day. "Clothes are in the old greenhouse, you freaks," Rico laughed. His head hurt, and he had cracked open a water bottle and downed a few acetaminophen. Trying to remember how many teeth he used to have was hurting, so he stopped bothering and compartmentalized as he had so many times before. Rico happy to be around his friends, and the concern washed away with the swelling. As he cooked, he looked outside and wondered where his car was. Oh well, he thought to himself and shrugged. The guys cycled through, got food, got their clothes, and headed out. A few insisted on staying, but he convinced them he just needed time. In the following weeks, they promised to check on him from time to time and mentioned in passing that a weird letter had come, saying about how a Joe had died. The letter looked legit, and something about an insurance payout and his bank account having way more zeros than it was supposed to. He'd been trying to find a checkbook to pay for the house bill because he figured it must be overdue, but the calendar on the wall had the wrong year and no checkbook to be found with his name. When the house statement came through to Rico's surprise, it was paid off. Something about insurance paying everything off. Someone named Joe had died. Rico felt like he should know this Joe guy, but nothing was immediately coming to mind. Whoever Joe was, Frederico figured it was very nice of him to think about paying off Rico's house. They must have been good friends, maybe, or family, but Rico couldn't remember. Rico had been cooped up for a while as he puttered away on his garden, trying to resurrect his little underground wellspring deal. It was miles and miles to even the next neighbor, and very improbable to travel by foot. If the heat didn't get you, some animal surely would. Rico had his 2 6-shooters, but wouldn't stand a chance against a pack of coyotes, for example. Rico hoped his friends would stop by and explain what was going on, so every day he repeated the same routine, unable to get more than half a mile before it got too risky. Then he started getting strange packages in the mail he didn't remember ordering. They were from a Joe. There'd be a knock in the morning, and he'd get to the door and packages would be sitting there. The first seeming like moving boxes, not exactly new items. Like he was getting all of Joe's stuff from him passing away. The items smelled familiar, but he couldn't quite place them. It was a cowboy hat that fit his head perfectly, along with pre-programmed radios to the local repeaters and simplex bands. He looked at the radio for clues, but all it had was a few digits, a number, and a few more digits. If he mashed enough buttons, there'd be 6 letters or so, but it wasn't very specific at all. Abbreviations or acronyms. Rico couldn't tell. Rico figured he was getting Joe's belongings. Maybe they were willed to him or something. The familiar smell of the clothing and gear were relaxing to Rico, and he accepted the items and was thankful. Out of respect for this Joe, Rico would do his best to honor him despite lack of memory. The weeks would go by and Rico kept working on his garden, trying to get ready for spring, but it was no use. Everything was dead and there was no efficient way for him to water the garden. The garden attempt. He worked to clean up his current well, but it only serviced a few appliances in his house. The well was a pipe in a hole drilled straight through the ground, with no access point, and he didn't dare touch it, for fear he'd mess up his current few systems it worked for. It was hooked up to some complicated systems that were self-sustaining, and it had always been way over Rico's head. Then one morning, after a week or 2 of being home, Rico woke up to a knock at the door again. He would get up to see who it was, and packages started arriving again from a Joe. This set of items shipped to him was a special milsurp shovel and legit pioneer's pickaxe. Rico opened another box and there was a new pair of worker gloves. His had been caked with years of use. These new gloves would keep his hands warm in the morning and cool during the day and well protected. He filled up a glass mason jar with water and found some tea bags in the back of the shelf in his kitchen. The sink, tub, and toilet pulled from an underground stream that had been set up so long ago. With his new tools, he walked outside with his glass jar and set it in the sun, with some paper and a rock on top so nothing could crawl in the jar and die without his permission. Rico nodded to the jar and began to walk towards the crusty, dead, failed gardening experience of past years for another attempt. He also knew he needed to get that well figured out. There were weird patches of sparse, less dead stuff around his land, but it was hard to pinpoint. He wished he could get up high and try to figure it out, then remembered this Joe guy had ordered him a weird electronic backpack he was supposed to take a look at. Rico went back inside to look for it. It stuck out in his memory due to being a weird-shaped backpack. Rico found the pack and dug through it only to realize it was mostly electronics and wires inside with a little drone attached integrally to the back. He tried to take the drone off the pack, but it was attached along with the battery charger and some other things Rico didn't recognize. The note attached identified it as a tiny drone made by some local drone maker that Joe had run into before, apparently. Rico shrugged, walked outside, and turned the drone on by pressing a button on the backpack. To his surprise, it was nearly fully charged. The cell phone buzzed in Rico's pocket, and the drone sent him a message. Ready to go. He pushed the button and a black and yellow drone zipped up, and a map appeared on Rico's phone. The colors seemed familiar to Rico, but maybe it was just because it looked like a bee. The house was scanned and appeared as a square with the house icon. A black triangle representing Rico appeared on the screen with a phone as an icon overlaying on top of him. The drone was represented as a little bee on the screen. The prior garden attempts got scanned as well, and each patch of faded green. More squares overlaid the screen here and there of different objects of importance as the drone started zigzagging across the homestead, scanning everything and uploading the data to the phone. A yellow and black blur zipped back and forth, mapping the area. Rico felt like he should be surprised, but was too enthralled with the influx of incoming data. He looked around and started heading towards the first highlighted square that said, "Water possible." With a shovel in one hand and a phone in the other, he stepped around boxes of scorched dirt, burned by both sun and wind. The little buzzing drone finished its scouting of the immediate area and flew back to Rico as he walked towards the first spot identified on his screen. The drone grappled onto Rico's backpack and attached itself with some magnets the backpack produced. Where there was an icon showing a battery depleting on his phone and a B logo, a battery with a plus icon appeared and the bar began filling back up. At that point it dawned on Rico that his backpack sort of looked like a little beehive. Someone was terribly clever, Federico mused to himself, admiring the attention to detail of the drone maker. With shovel and pickaxe in hand, Rico walked a ways towards where the grass wasn't quite as dead. Rico wasn't sure if the sun was playing a trick with the light, but he was sure this grass wasn't quite dead. He squished the blades of grass and they didn't disintegrate like everything else around him. It wasn't hot yet, but it was gonna get hot. Rico took the neck wrap he had in his pocket and put it over his head to cover him. It was black and yellow with a snake telling people not to tread. With his trusty new old pickaxe, he started smashing the pokey part of his mattock at the crusty ground. With many smacks and pokes and digs and claws later, the ground became less like a crust and more like a swamp. Rico got the shovel out of the ground where he had stomped and stabbed it in with much resistance. It took equal effort to pull the shovel out as if the ground didn't want to give it up. After an hour or two of picking and shoveling, Rico got down to a little puddle of water he didn't know what to do with. It was so hot. Rico checked his map and saw some plywood identified, so he went and grabbed it, dragging the plywood back to his makeshift hole wasn't a big deal, and in a short amount of time the hole was covered. A dirty piece of plywood now lay over the hole he'd made so nobody could crawl in it and die without his permission. He thought for a second, decided to shovel a light amount of dirt on top so it wouldn't dry out, then shoved the shovel in the ground again next to it as a marker. Rico chuckled to himself, imagining coming back to 500 shovels in the ground to make sure he never found the hole again. After maybe 20 minutes or so walk back to his house, he saw his tea was ready and got some oven gloves to bring it back to the house right as it was getting too hot out. The house didn't have AC, but a bunch of fans kicked on to start circulating the air. It was too dry to need AC. The airflow was plenty. Rico sat down with his tea, drank about half the jar, and started to doze off. He dreamed of different times, not necessarily better or worse, of a guy named Joe that used to get on buses with his friends and drive to rallies to cover all the stupidity going on. All of the death threats and brotherhood, getting out of situations nobody would have considered possible. So many times where they could have easily got killed. Chapter 4. Who's at the door? Rico woke up at the start. It was evening and cooling down, with still a few more hours of light. He felt rested, and his head less sore. A fly landed on his arm and he tried to swat at it. He was too fast, as they always were. A second attempt at swinging at where it would theoretically be sailed right over it. He wiggled his arm and the fly didn't move. Puzzled, Rico was wondering if he was hallucinating the fly, as it decided to bite him with a chomp. Ow! Rico flailed around trying to kill the sumbitch, but he couldn't. As he swung around and his arm hurt, he activated the drone on accident. It sprung to life and started chasing the fly around the room, trying to hit it with its rotors. Rico ran to the bathroom as his arm swelled up immediately. Some time of biting fly, Rico cursed under his breath as he tried to run water over the fresh wound. The house didn't pull a ton of water. It was enough for a very brief rinse of a shower or to pour a gallon here or there to wash dishes or get a drink. Not enough to do much else. Rico stopped running the water. It wasn't helping, he's only wasting the precious resource. A thought popped into his mind. Baking soda. He ran around looking for baking soda, though he didn't know why. His arm, burning like acid, was on it, distracting his thoughts. Rico tossed every cupboard looking for soda and found none. Desperately, he looked in the fridge and nothing, and in the freezer. There's a package in there with an arm and a hammer that was supposed to be keeping the freezer fresh. It would have to do. Rico got the baking soda out of the box and into a cup with a little water and a spoon and began swishing it around until he made a paste worthy to clean teeth with. He wouldn't, though. That'd be gross. Instead, it went on his arm and he began packing the wound. In the background, the drone was isolating and cornering the fly, who was now stuck on a window. The heat intensified on Rico's arm, and he checked his veins to make sure nothing was crawling its way to his heart, and nothing was. The skin blistered more, and Rico got a credit card out to press across the skin to see if there was some sort of stinger. Using tweezers could potentially squeeze even more poison in, he remembered from somewhere. With the press of a credit card, no stinger came out, but the wound oozed something that didn't look good. Rico wiped it off with a paper towel and applied more improvised alkaline paste on the wound. The blister festered and cracked as if fighting the high pH levels of the sodium bicarbonate. Rico was beginning to lose his mind with pain as the drone hit the fly finally, sending it in a green, splattery mess all over the window, looking out over the garden attempts outside. The sun began to set as Rico packed more of his compound on the wounded area of his arm. The drone flew around for a few more moments, satisfied it killed the bug, and crawled back onto the backpack and went to sleep. Rico broke the blister one more time as it was oozing through the crust he'd made. He washed it off again with a clean paper towel and got more of his mixture on the wound and packed it, not thinking clearly and thirsty, thinking he was reaching for his tea. He downed the rest of his batch of baking soda and water. It tasted awful, and he tossed the cup aside looking for his tea. He found it as the pain nearly overtook him, along now with nausea from the gross taste in his mouth. In less than several gulps, the rest of his tea was gone, and he lay on the kitchen floor clutching his burning arm. Pain overtaking disgust, Rico passed back out on his cool kitchen floor, his final thoughts being what would happen if he ever had to deal with more than one fly at a time. His unconscious body shivered. Chapter 5. New Beginnings. Days seemed like hours, or maybe it was the other way around. Rico wasn't sure. When his eyes opened, it was dark. He looked at his phone and expected it to be dead, but it was still on. His eyes blurred, and they were back again, trying to focus on the battery. After a few blinks, the battery looked like the dials and readout on a semi-truck. The readouts were blurry, and Joe was trying to wake himself up in every way he could think. He shook his head and nothing. Foot on the pedal, trying to get the goods in his trailer to the next destination like he was supposed to. He shifted gears subconsciously as he rounded corner after corner, trying to scare and startle himself into a prayer that adrenaline would overcome this sudden and suspicious fatigue. Joe tried imagining metal music in his head and turned the radio up, but it didn't seem to be working. Some stupid message kept replaying on the radio. Driving while distracted countermeasures prevented him from switching to a CD player or anything to that effect. Joe shouted at the radio and tried to maintain focus, trying to channel all the energy and rage he could muster, trying to regain some semblance of awareness. There was no place to pull over, he told himself, to maybe scare himself into waking up. He smacked himself some more than pinching. Joe briefly thought maybe to poke himself in the eye or something, but then chuckled, realizing that was a horrible idea. Another corner, and he could barely keep his eyes open, and when they were open, it was blurry. He tried just closing his left eye, then his right, but his eyelids were heavy and wanted to stick shut. Another corner, and he thought he was seeing some headlights in his rear view. He should just let them go by, and incline was coming. He was so tired. Out of the corner of his eyes, he saw angels beckoning him out of the truck door, but he shook his head. It would be so easy to just go with the angels, he told himself. A beautiful angel with a tiara on her head and a gold choker around her neck, welcoming him outside the truck. Down the river, so many feet below off the cliff, he imagined a water angel with blue wings on her, had bubbles flowing up from around her and big doe eyes. "Come join us," she said, welcoming. She beckoned him with her hands, one stretched in front of the other as if to reel him in. They both seemed so welcoming. The headlights were coming alongside him now. He should have snapped to awareness, but he was so groggy he was almost driving in a complete trance. The driver of the car was trying to speed past, but it was a very pathetically weak car, and they couldn't get it going very fast. A car was now also coming towards them, and Joe didn't want them to die in a head-on collision. He imagined a family with children in the back, and how he would do anything to preserve life, regardless of their beliefs or culture. The car tried to pass them on the left now, also desperate and running out of options. Swerved right into Joe's tractor. A new angel arrived out of the corner of his other window, one made of rock and one made of fire. They beckoned him to follow them. As he resigned to the fatigue, he followed the two lovely angels of stone and cinder into a cliff face, with a little waterfall coming down. Rico woke up with tears streaming down his eyes, confused as to what was going on. His head hurt. The thought trailed off. He lifted up his arm and he felt it, and the swelling and tenderness had gone down. He tried to look at it with his phone, but the battery flashed for a second at the wound and then died out of battery. The only glimpse in the darkness was the alkaline crest he had made. Wild dogs off in the distance yelping about something, probably happy it was nighttime. Rico crawled off to find his phone charger. After shuffling and wiggling around for a while trying to find his way, he bumped into his drone backpack. Usually he would use his cell phone to light the way, but to no avail. Ricky resolved that when his phone turned back on, he'd put it in airliner mode so he wouldn't keep trying to talk to cell phone towers anymore. That would help keep the battery going longer since there was nobody to call anymore. The thought trailed off again. He fumbled around with his hand and bumped the sore spot on something. Recoiling pain, he used his other hand fumbling around on the pack, hence feeling several objects in the darkness until resting upon a cord. Rico had remembered seeing this among all the other gadgets and gave it a tug. It extended a foot and he tried to stick the port into the phone a few times. Rico wondered for a second if it was the headphone jack port, but then realized the cord was upside down. Like micro USB cords always seem to be, the cord went in with a snap and he set the phone up unconsciously like he had so many times to set on. The thought trailed off. The backpack seemed to be set up like a truck console and it had a spot for his phone to rest in. The phone fit securely and Rico slumped back down on the floor, still exhausted. After a few moments, the phone started talking to the powerful battery bank in the backpack. The smart ports detected the phone and found the perfect power levels to start sending. The phone received much needed juice and within a few seconds powered itself back on to see what had happened. Rico crawled up into a ball and went back to sleep, peacefully this time. Chapter 6. A New Day. The sun rose in the sky like it did every day. There was a package arrival indicating knock at the door like there had been throughout the mornings prior. Gone were the politics and bugs and identity. Only Ringo and his drone. Rico, not Ringo. The battery was at half-life for the drone's battery pack, so Rico needed to do something, but he wasn't sure what. He hadn't had power at his house for ages. He went to the door and there was no package delivery person, of course. There were, however, a few boxes waiting in his front doorstep. Rico looked back and forth and saw no way that they could have got here. He realized his front gate must be open from his friends leaving and he'd been too busy to close it. Rico was lucky that nobody around here dared to steal packages. With a nod to himself, Rico grabbed the boxes and shuffled them inside. Grabbing his multi-tool off a small shelf by the door, he sat on the cold floor opening boxes. Digging through the packages, he kept getting from Joe until he found some solar panels and an induction power unit. In the box was some instructions and some arrows pointing which way everything went. There was a charge controller, an inverter, and a bunch of plugs and cords. There was a handwritten diagram someone wrote, and so Rico put the multi-tool in his pocket and dragged the solar panels outside and found a place to put them. With the broom leaning up against the house, he brushed off the dust and dirt from around the raised platform and with a flat shovel scraped up the long-dead plant life. On his phone, the drone had told him this was the best feasible spot for solar. It had been marked with a little sun and lightning bolt. Rico looked at the platform and couldn't figure out what it used to be. It was clearly an old concrete pad. Maybe someone had built it intending on it being for something else, maybe a wind turbine or something. He tried to remember back and thought he was supposed to put a wind turbine here, then shrugged. Maybe it turned out to be a bad spot for wind or something. The phone had other spots marked on the map. One looked like a turbine and a lightning bolt. It was as if the phone was telling him it had found a better spot for solar. Maybe he would check that spot out later. For right now, Ricky had to set up the solar panel array. With the solar panels set up, pointed to where the sun mostly was, he attached the long red and black cords and ran them back to the house. Ricky used a port in the wall where some satellite dish people had run line through ages ago, then he ended up never using. Rico then found a spot for the charge controller where it would be out of the way and set it up. Black and red cords got plugged into the charge controller, then Rico had to dig around for an old 12-volt battery. He needed a sealed, deep cycle battery that would last him a while reliably without having catastrophic failure. Ricky tried to rack his brain without getting a headache on what around the house would have a battery. He knew that one wouldn't arrive, as they would cost hundreds to ship, and nobody would drive a battery to him with whatever was going on. He could set up the rest, though, without a battery, and decided to go send out the drone while he finished. Rico walked outside, programmed his drone to a wider search radius and to the near limit of its battery, and drew his finger up and down the road nearby his house. With the push of a final button, Rico sent the drone off with new search perimeters. He went back inside once the drone took off and began setting up the wires for the inverter. After clearing off some space in the corner of the living room, he was ready for the battery, should the drone find one to use. Rico looked at the inverter and realized he needed things to actually plug into it. He had the backpack, of course, but wondered what else he could plug in. The fridge hadn't been used in years, it seemed like, and not much else needed electricity. The water tank heated using fuel from an underground propane tank that had enough fuel in it for years at the rate Rico rationed it, but the stove used gas also. That gave Rico an idea, and he ran a second pair of black and red wires to a hot water controller. He would now prioritize electric over the gas. Heating the water, Rico thought about it for a second and realized he'd been taking cool showers anyway because that was what he preferred. His body had been so sore, like he'd taken a massive beating or something. Rico shrugged and mused. He'd basically been using no fuel to keep the hot water warm, and with the system automatically pressurized, no electricity to pump water. He went and flicked the light switch. The lights didn't turn on. Rico stood there for a second and wondered how long the power had been out. The electronics had been unplugged for a long time to save electricity. The world spun for a second as Rico tried to piece it together unconsciously. He started to get dizzy until his phone buzzed, notifying Rico that there was a dead electric car located some miles away on the main road. He pressed the button that overrode the rest of the drone script and had it come back. Rico went and filled up his jar with water again and plopped the tea bags inside and smartly set a strainer on top. He would have fresh tea when he got back from rescuing the battery. Now he only had to think for a second where a wheelbarrow or car was and went to check his phone. There was a bunk on the window, and Rico spun with a revolver around in hand when he saw the buzzer drone was tapping on the window wanting to be let in. He'd forgot to set the backpack outside. Rico opened the window and the drone seemed to look at him for a second and then buzz in to find the beehive-styled backpack, climb onto it and attach itself for a recharge. With a check of the phone, Rico saw his battery was almost full and on Wi-Fi mode still. He nodded and checked the map to see a wheelbarrow logo and set off to find the identified wagon to see what condition it was in. Trusty broom in hand, Rico set off, leaving his backpack behind with a cowboy hat on and a can of Fixie Flat in his back pocket, a tea jar sitting in the sun ready for his return. The wheelbarrow ended up being in decent enough shape, with only some cobwebs and dirt structurally speaking. The tire was flat, of course, but the half-full can of Fixie Flat had the tire full and temporarily plugged in no time. Rico stuffed the can in his back pocket and put his leather work gloves on, and away he went down the road. Chapter 7. Asphalt Journey. No cars drove by in either direction. He seemed to recall that it wasn't a terribly busy road anyway, so walking down the side of the road wasn't of any personal risk or consequence. Rico tried stopping and listening every once in a while, but didn't even hear any farm equipment. Maybe nobody was around, he wondered. Maybe off to an event in town. Of course, Rico had no way of getting anywhere. His vehicle was suspiciously gone. He tried to remember what kind of vehicle he usually drove, but it hurt to attempt memory recall. About 2 miles of bopping down the road, Rico had a lot of time to think. This used to be a dirt road that was nearly impassable when the rains would hit, and it was all prior BLM land, shoved up against native land, and hadn't had repairs funded in ages. Finally, though, the government had to give up the land and the state was able to fund roads again. Rico recalled the children unable to go to school because the buses couldn't even make the drive. Finally, all got fixed, though, and he stopped as a family of tumbleweeds rolled by as if on a predetermined path. He restrained himself from trying to think about the past, though, and thought about other things. The pants he was wearing. He decided he really liked them. A good pair of pants was nice to have. And then he looked down at his boots. Rico's boots were a special pair of military boots that Marines wore in the sandbox. They had little vents for dry, hot, arid climates, and he realized he could walk in them for days without any issues or even having to take them off. The good stuff stayed in and the bad stuff stayed out. He nodded to himself and resumed walking when the tumbleweeds had passed. His hat, he had worn it for so long, but it was still awesome. A cowboy hat that matched his 2 6-shooters very well. His shirt, a long-sleeve, loose-fitting, breathable ripstop design, kept him cool all day and decent enough at night. And of course his belt buckle, which wasn't too abusively big, but had enough real estate to sport a snake coiled around itself ready to strike. His worker gloves that he'd got from the mail. Rico's thought trailed off as he walked down the lowly road, trying to find his vehicle the drone identified. He checked his phone map and it was straight ahead in another mile. Possibly over this hill. He looked onward as he trotted along at a steady and confident pace. Rico wondered if the software map application had a topographical function. He would check later. He put his phone away as he walked with his wheelbarrow and looked down at his gloves. He tried to relax his brain to see if the history of his gloves would come into focus without causing a nosebleed or worse. The gloves had a logo. 3 arrows pointed to each other. Maybe a recyclery? He guessed at some point that he must have had some friends at a recyclery. Rico let the thought go before it caused any mental discomfort. The realization satisfied Rico enough for now, and he nodded to himself as he crested the hill and saw an abandoned hybrid vehicle. A thought stopped him. Seeing the vehicle abandoned, he imagined fire and violence. A shock coursed through his body, jolting him. He immediately became more aware of his surroundings and regretted not having the drone. Rico set the wheelbarrow down and surveyed the surroundings, trying to conceal himself, but concluding there was nowhere to hide. This was the perfect ambush point. He stood and listened, but could hear nothing. Shrugging his shoulders and beginning to descend, Rico thought of an old Western movies walking through the canyon. It seemed like every single canyon the hero would get attacked. The cautionary music would play, a pebble would roll down the hill, and it would hit the fan, cueing the cornball, ricochet sound effects, and echo. The hero was always fine, though, Rico surmised. However, he usually did have some sort of backup. Rico had no such backup, and high above some buzzards flew around in a circular pattern, seeming to be bored. "You'll get no such desire from my corpse," Rico thought in defiance as he cautiously approached the disabled hybrid vehicle. Rico wanted to make this fast and thought he should smash the window, remembering a video where people tried to smash through a door never actually trying to open it. Federico tried the car door and it was locked. Not getting discouraged, he tried the other three and opened the trunk. Then the trunk. There was some kind of hybrid motorcycle bicycle thingy in the way, and while it had a formidable battery, Rico was here for the big score. With his multi-tool out, Rico maneuvered the bike out of the way, which was attached to a hitch of some sort. Rico surprised himself when the hatch opened, and he quickly crawled through to pop the hood and then crawled back out to his wheelbarrow. He realized after doing it this was a wise decision. Most modern car alarms would go off opening a door from the inside without the key fob. If he hadn't attracted any attention yet, that definitely would have. No time would be wasted searching through the car. Rico was here for one thing and one thing only. He only prayed the battery's electrolytes hadn't been cooked off from being exposed in the prolonged direct sun. He quietly closed the hatch and almost tripped over the motorcycle thing. It was surprisingly light but sturdy, but Rico was able to catch himself and kick it out of the way at the same time. His heart stopped a beat and he looked around to make sure nobody heard. There was not a sound in the whole small ravine. Rico then made his way around the hybrid car to the hood and carefully lifted the hood and pulled out the stand, setting it in place. There the battery was. It looked brand new. Rico wondered if there was anything wrong with the car, or if maybe it ran. Rico cared little. Finding the keys could turn out to be a waste of time, and this vehicle couldn't drive off-road for 2 seconds, so using the multi-tool, Rico was able to make quick work of disconnecting the battery. He was very careful to not make contact with the two leads and fry himself or make any unnecessary noise. Once the leads were loose and pointed away, Rico got the battery out of the hybrid vehicle and hefted the nearly new battery into his wheelbarrow as quietly as possible. He managed to avoid smacking the battery on anything or smashing his hands and set it into the wheelbarrow gingerly. Hiss. Rico heard a hissing noise as the wheelbarrow let out all of its tires air. I guess that's as far as the fixie flat was gonna buy me, Rico sighed to himself, figuring the rest of the can would be a waste and leave him stranded halfway. Also, the car battery was way too heavy for him to carry more than a couple 100 feet. It weighed close to 60 pounds, Rico imagined. As if on cue, he felt more than heard a rumbling in the distance. Something was coming. Looking around frantically, Rico realized there was nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. This trip would be for nothing, and no wheelbarrow and no battery, and he was very distraught. Right then a memory popped into his mind of riding a bicycle through an apocalyptic city for some reason, and thought of the bike. Recalling crawling over some webbing in the back of the car, he opened the rear hatch and unlatched the webbing and threw it over his head. Rico then picked up the hybrid electric bike and wheeled it to the wheelbarrow. The wheels seemed sturdy and like they were built for off-road mountain biking. He put the kickstand down and hefted the battery onto a steel basket on the back of the bike, designed for carrying small-sized belongings. The springs on the bike, to absorb weight, barely strained. Rico understood that the bicycle-motorcycle hybrid was considerably overbuilt, which made him happy. He took the netting draped over his head and wrapped it around the battery so it would be sturdy, then took off. Whoever was coming down the road, Rico realized, may be hostile. Hopping on the bike and kicking up the stand, Rico took off as fast as he could. He pedaled as fast as his legs would take him down the road. Rico hoped the people would stop at the car and he could escape once breaking the line of sight over the next hill. He pedaled, and the vehicle got closer behind him over the hill. Frantic, Rico looked for some buttons to press to hopefully switch gears so he could make it up the hill more efficiently. The saddle in between the hills had gone well, but the incline was wearing him out quick. Due to the battery, he was tugging along. He wished he'd been able to attach the battery to the front somewhere, but there had been no room. So he felt like he was tugging 100 pounds behind him, though it was only 40. It felt like 60, though. Rico tried everything he could to get his mind off it, and seconds felt like hours. He began mashing the buttons as he was already nearing exhaustion, and the heat halfway up the hill, his momentum lost, and his vehicle about to crest the hill behind. He found a button that switched from his pedal power to the stored electrical power. Upon pressing the button, the bicycle switched to motorcycle mode and he jetted up the hill at a brisk 35 miles per hour, completely silent. Rico pedaled away, not seeing a gauge anywhere on how much power was stored. It was probably there somewhere, but he was in panic mode trying to escape. He crested the hill as flashbacks came of a guy in a truck, speeding around bends and turns, being pursued. Rico shook his head to clear his thoughts and almost tumbled down the hill. The motorcycle auto-corrected his angle, though, and saved him from what would have been a horrible crash, considering he had no helmet or other padding. His head worked clearly again. He sped and pedaled as fast as the bike would take him. A thought had been to potentially ride across the plains to enter his property from the back end, hoping potentially the people behind him weren't in a four-wheel drive, but they sounded like they'd been in a big vehicle. The last thing Rico wanted to do was to make a giant smoky trail directly to his homestead. He had an access gate out back that he left open, but didn't want anyone to find it. It was too small for pickup trucks, but the last thing he needed was punks in mopeds riding around on his property or something. He took the most direct route and got to his gate as he heard the vehicle rev back up, again cresting the hill. Them stopping at the car hadn't bought him much time. He got himself on the bike and the gate, shut it behind him, and rushed back in his house to hunker down. There were already some new boxes at the door, so he threw them inside. Getting his tea and parking the bike behind his house, he went inside, shut the door, got his radio and listened for chatter, and peered out towards the gate. Then he waited. Chapter 8. The clock is ticking. Nobody pinged him on the radio of the local repeaters or any of the common simplex channels. Nobody came down the road. It was Rico, all alone. Did he imagine the whole thing? He looked around and everything was as it was. He looked at the radio, some memories trying to painfully bubble to the top. A radio in a truck, maybe? Maybe some radios at a large public event or something? It made him dizzy, so he tried to stare at a cleared-off piece of floor to gain clarity again. He realized he was breathing heavy and a drip of blood hung off the tip of his nose and some more out his mouth, but he quickly started to calm down. He checked his phone and some time had passed, so maybe he'd fallen asleep and dreamt the entire situation. There was still some time left of the day, so he decided to go outside and see if he could hear anything. Rico's tea was sitting outside and nearly done. He checked it for bugs, and it was still bug-free. There was a hybrid motorcycle-bicycle combination sitting out there, though, with a deep cycle vehicle battery on it. Now, Rico did remember that. There'd been a large vehicle chasing him or something to that effect, and he got this bicycle-motorcycle deal but had to sacrifice his wheelbarrow. A fair trade, Rico consoled to himself. He eyeballed the battery, and it seemed to be in good shape. Rico brought the heavy battery inside and set it in the space he'd cleared and plugged in all the leads. The charge controller had a few digits and buttons blinking from the solar, but had nothing really to do with the power. Energy. Once Rico plugged in the battery to the charge controller and inverter, the entire system lit up happy with lights. In tandem, the charge controller for the hot water also lit up and set to prioritize the new incoming power source. With some quick math, Rico saw that the solar panels would bring in more than enough power to charge the battery healthily and keep the hot water going all day. If he needed to, it would be easy to switch the hot water over to battery or whatever if he wanted. Otherwise, he could use the inverter off the battery to plug in his drone and phone. Excited, he went and got the drone backpack and plugged it in along with his phone. Both started charging away. A check on the charge controller showed that the battery was nearly at full power and was beginning to cycle. Satisfied, Rico went back outside to see what there was to do. Chapter 19, remainder of the day, or Chapter 9, remainder of the day. Digging through the cellar that Rico had, he found cases of water that he had stored behind. He always knew they were here and probably even used some when his friends were over last, but his mind had been really preoccupied. A bottle in each hand, he stuffed one in his pocket after taking out the fixie flat and setting it on the counter. It wobbled for a second and then stopped. Rico nodded to it, downing a half a bottle of water in a seemingly single gulp. Rico hadn't realized how thirsty he was. The water hit his exposed nerves in his mouth and he nearly screamed in pain. He already knew he didn't have any emergency dental stuff in his cupboards. Out of frustration or as a distraction from the oral pain, he got out his multi-tool and went through his new boxes. While lamenting he'd likely get no more boxes due to his closed gates, he opened these final boxes to see some essential oils and dental kits, cotton swabs and clove oil, along with wax and dental cement. There was also varying sizes of sanitized gauze. Lastly, there was a squirter-type bottle with an angled nozzle in millimeter denominations. Rico's jaw throbbed in pain as he read through the instructions. Firstly, it said to rinse the wound out with water using the syringe-looking squirter, so he did that. The water from the bottle wasn't too hot or too cold, but the water still hurt as Rico felt the water pressure loosen crud from his mouth and into the sink. After 3 or 4 rinses all throughout his mouth, it was time for the next step. The textile kept indicating eugenol was what he needed to be looking for pain relief, so that's what Rico looked for. The clove oil's main ingredient was a high percentage of eugenol, so that must be the right thing. Reading through the instructions, it showed many ways to use the clove oil or clove bud, including letting gauze soak in it or try to squirt or drop a few drops into the spot. Throbbing increased as Rico felt ready to either scream or cry in pain and quickly got a pair of disposable nitrile gloves on. He read that this oil could burn the living hell out of your skin if you got it on you. He popped the top off the clove oil bottle and held it upside down, then shook it a little to get a few drops on the gauze. Upon the gauze being thoroughly soaked, Rico rolled the gauze up like a burrito and packed it in the wound that seemed the most likely to be causing him pain. Keeping in mind it only took a few drops to soak the gauze. Any more could make him very sick and would burn him as well. Within moments, an intense burn began, as the pain decreased, then went away from the worst spot. The burn quickly dulled, then subsided. Rico coughed out some clove vapors, then sighed relief. Rico repeated the process for his remaining oral wounds until all the pain subsided. He felt like he could almost think for once. The burn was gone, the pain was gone, and it smelled like the comforting smell of cloves. He wrapped up his gloves and tossed them in the garbage and wiped a bit of the burning concentrated liquid off his numbing lips. He packaged all the dental medication items back in their bags and tossed them in his pack for safekeeping. Rico waited a few minutes until he figured it was safe to drink some water again. When a sudden thought piqued his interest, he carefully finished off the water bottle with subsequent sips and went to the hybrid motorcycle to start mashing more buttons. A brief but controlled look at the control panel, now that he wasn't being pursued, showed where the battery indicator was. He hit a button and it blinked up to 2/3 and then disappeared. Rico decided he would pedal it around to see how much charge he would get off it. There wasn't really anywhere he needed to go and wasn't in a big hurry to get back to the road anytime soon, so he decided to journey to the watering hole he had been working on. Rico was about to get on the bike when a tiny pain pricked his skull. "A helmet!" Rico exclaimed to himself, but where would he find a helmet? Calmly he let his mind work over the conundrum without pushing it too hard. Paintball! A thought popped up. Ah, yes. Rico thought to himself. The guys had come here a few times to play paintball. He went back into the house, digging through the various chests and bins he had in his house until he found a helmet that was sort of like a motocross helmet. Ricky tried to put it on his head, but it wouldn't fit. The cowboy hat smooshed around his face as if trying to hang on. Glad that nobody was around to rip on him for being silly looking, Rico took off his cowboy hat and set it on the counter. It looked very sad. To attempt to make amends, Rico poofed it up so it looked proud and proper. With that, Rico patted it gently as if it was a loyal pet, and with a nod whispered to the Western-themed hat, "West is the best." The motocross-style paintball helmet wrapped around his head perfectly and sported very comfy cushions and a standard headphone jack and mic port to boot. He bonked himself lightly on the noggin a few times to get an idea for the impact resistance, and his head barely felt the impact. A solid face and mouth shield kept him safe for any debris he might be kicking up as he pedaled around. A final idea crossed his mind as his brain seemed to be working well all of a sudden, and he dug through the chests one more time. Through the bins, he found a polymer-reinforced motorcycle jacket that was a hand-me-down for paintball. It fit him well enough, and he zipped it up and walked back to his hybrid mountain bike, feeling a bit like a biker badass. Pedaling was a bit weird on the rumbly ground, and it took him a while to get used to the different kind of shock, but before long he was bumping around like a pro. At least he felt like a pro, and he tried to imagine he looked like a pro, but inside he was as giddy as a kid with a new bike. Every once in a while, though, he'd hit a bump a certain way and would get a zing in his arm from the bug bite, but thankfully the pain had faded fast from his alkaline paste he made, and in not too long he saw his shovel in the distance and knew he'd reached his hopefully soon-to-be waterhole. Sweating from the pedaling, but otherwise feeling pretty good, he stopped near the hole and kicked the bike's stand out. It stood fast on the solid ground and otherwise seemed no worse for wear. He took his helmet and jacket off and hung them on the bike. He looked down to his hole, though, and, with his hands still gloved from before, removed the plywood cover. To his satisfaction, there was a little puddle developing in the hole he had dug. He imagined underneath being a spring somewhere, or possibly an underground aquifer that was leaching into a stream or river miles away. He looked around and saw some hills in the distance, but that was about it. Rico noted to himself to bring the drone out next time once it was at full charge to see what it could see. He climbed down into the pit, half sliding until he sloshed into the water. He remembered his boots had air vents, but would hopefully resist the water for a little while as he dug. He also mentally kicked himself for not thinking of a ladder, but was confident he could climb his way out if he needed to. The hole wasn't that deep yet, so he dug and he dug. He saw some bubbles and he dug some more. Then another thought popped in his head. What if he digs so deep he falls into the water? That seemed like a bad thing, but was it plausible? Rico imagined falling in an underground reservoir miles in diameter. But what if he could stay down there? He wondered what it'd be like if he could breathe indefinitely and explore every inch and map it somehow. Wouldn't it be amazing? Then he felt himself sinking. Was it just his imagination? He blinked a few times to clear the cobwebs of his daydream and saw he was in fact sinking. Not one to immediately panic, Rico started straddling the hole as it began filling up with water. It seemed slow, but it couldn't have been fast. Neither option mattered to Federico. He wanted out. The shovel still in his hand, and the dirt having been flung out the hole to somewhere beyond, he was unable to get a foothold or a grip purchased anywhere on the walls of the hole he dug. Trying to fight panic away, he realized in his daydream he had dug further than he wanted without figuring out a ladder system. Rope was useless as there was nothing to tie off to, but a ladder sure would have been helpful. He pushed out the shoulda, woulda, coulda from his mind and began trying to stab the shovel deep into the wall's face. He wiggled it in and tried slamming it deeper as the water got up past his ankles. With several slams and wiggles, he got the shovel slammed in to where it seemed solid and made a gesture to climb on top of it. Rico got one leg over and it held, and then he got the other and sat on it. The shovel seemed solid, but Rico couldn't rely on his imagination anymore for how long the shovel may hold. He envisioned himself swimming through the aquifer again briefly and managed to hoist himself up on one foot and then the other. It was enough for him to get a leg up over the embankment and pull himself up horizontally enough to roll to safety as the shovel plopped down into the hole. Safe from the pit of water filling up, Rico was relieved, but then realized that was his only rounded shovel. He also saw that his empty water bottle had fallen out of his pocket and was bobbing up and down in the water as the hole filled up. Before long, the shovel was floating also. Rico sat in amazement as both objects floated up to him in unison as if they were longing slowly to be reunited. He sat at the edge of the hole for the rest of the day in awe as his hole filled up. The only thing he was missing was his cowboy hat. Chapter 10. Coming Together. Eventually the water bottle and shovel floated to where he could reach them. Rico played with the idea of drinking tons of the water, but remembered that his shovel had been sitting in it. He hoped that his shovel, or worse yet, his boots, hadn't contaminated the water. Rico didn't remember stepping in any poo lately, but you just never know, so he didn't drink any of the water yet. He wanted to shovel more, but the shovel needed to dry out. He shuffled the plywood over his watering hole superstitiously, worrying that it'd somehow get contaminated or something would drink it all, or someone would fall in it, or it'd mysteriously dry up, or end up being an illusion. Lots of ors, so that was Rico's cue to head home and grab his tea and call it a night. He hopped on his bike, put his helmet and jacket again, and pedaled his way home. Tomorrow he would bring his drone and shovel out a waterway. His sun tea lulled him to sleep as his new battery heated his water and kept his electronics charged. Before he fell asleep, he remembered to plug in his radio as well. Maybe he would find somewhere tomorrow to get a better signal he didn't know. He'd been leaving it on the repeater, but never heard anything. Finally giving up on waiting for someone to chime in on the repeater, Rico shut his radio off and fell asleep. There were no vivid dreams, only a fleeting idea of a swarm of bugs chasing him down the road instead of a pickup truck. His arm throbbed gently in the night, thankfully not enough to cause him to lose any sleep. Chapter 11. Get to Work. He woke up the next morning on the kitchen floor, like he had been so many nights before. A knock-a-knock told him that packages had arrived at the door. Rico wasn't sure why he kept falling asleep on the kitchen floor, but it seemed to be where he felt the most comfortable. Rico floundered around for his cowboy hat. Sure, he left it laying around. He refused to get up without it on his head. The hat had been intentionally left behind on his adventure yesterday, but it was probably for the best. Bouncing around on a bike would make it easy to lose his hat, he imagined. Going on without his hat isn't a future he'd be willing to accept. Rico shook his head in a sort of reverse agreement. No way, Jose. This hat goes with me everywhere from now on, as he apologized to his hat. He went out to check what packages had arrived, and they appeared to be a bunch of heirloom seeds. Thanks, Joe, Rico whispered under his breath appreciatively. Rico looked on towards the gate to see if it was still shut and locked, and it was. He tossed the box up and down a few times and realized it weighed almost nothing, and imagined the delivery person flying the package over the gate with a drone or something. Well played, delivery person. Well played, Rico said proudly under his breath. Rico's stomach grumbled as he tried to remember when the last time he ate was, or even what he ate. He dug through one of the several pantries and found some granola that had been sealed up with reusable food-grade oxygen absorbers. Rico poured some into a cup and began munching. It hurt at first, and then he remembered to chew on the parts of his mouth that weren't injured. It was a challenge momentarily, but it was a self-correcting issue, and he quickly got a handle on it. The food tasted delicious to him as smoky and savory flavors bloomed across his taste buds. It sparked a memory, and he grabbed another bag called Lunch Blend. The breakfast blend was much more molasses, honey, and maple syrup, whereas the lunch blend was more cracker barrel style. He forgot where he got all this from, but remembered buying it online, he thought. XPX something or the other used to make it. He had an online store or something. Shipped by the gallon Ziploc bags, stored for years. Or zipper bags, whoops. Sealed. Rico took a gallon lunch blend and poured a third of it into a quart bag and stuffed it into a cargo pocket. He sealed the gallon bag back up and made sure the moisture pack that had come with it was still there. There wasn't really any humidity up here, but Rico wasn't taking any chances. Once those moisture packs hit atmosphere, they were useless in a day or so. So that was the best place for it, he reckoned. Rico sat for a minute, remembered he had to actually drink something with his breakfast, and realized he hadn't been drinking much until before bed. Remembering his mouth again, he carefully got out a gallon of his tea down the hatch without too much pain. The clove oil was really helping him out. Finishing his tea, he grabbed the empty water bottle from his pocket that he'd rescued from the water pit earlier and lobbed it into the recycling bin. That gave him a second to pause and chuckled to himself that he hadn't heard the recycling truck ever go by since he'd been back. He tried to remember which day and couldn't, looking up at the calendar. He saw it was the wrong month anyway and checked his phone. Rico adjusted the calendar to the right day and that he had up on the wall. It was a trucking calendar of cool trucks at different job sites doing tons of valuable work. He sneered, though, as he remembered looking at all the pictures, and the last picture for the new year was an automated truck. All he could think of were various near-future movies where cars and trucks would get hacked and kill everyone, not to mention all of the truck drivers would be unemployed. Rico tried to remember what he had done for employment, but couldn't remember. Best he could figure he was retired and that he had a friend named Joe that liked to send him presents that was maybe interested in vehicle logistics. Never a return address, though, just where the packages were ordered from, and he hoped someday he could repay this Joe guy. The first packages had come from an actual estate sale or something, but Rico hadn't recognized the address. With a new water bottle in hand, the second from the day before, he slammed it all down and refilled it from the sink. A thought crossed his mind that this water could be contaminated also, but remembered that the stones or sand or something filtered it all. He had no idea. Weird water voodoo. That made Rico chuckle. Water voodoo. The thought cracked him up. I got the voodoo that you do right here. He patted his 2 6-guns on each side. Lucy and Betsy always got my back. Then he wondered for a second, was that their respective names? He looked at the carvings on each of the ornate handles, 2 fine pieces of craftsmanship that had been passed down for generations, kept his bloodline alive for so long. Rico scratched his head with one while looking at the other. It says blood. I wonder what the other one says. He started scratching his head with blood and looked at the other one. It says pain. Blood and pain? He had a flashback for a second that they had been Justice and Liberty. Oh well, who was he to argue with what they were named? He decided that they were going to be Lucy and Felicia anyway. Wait. Lucy and Mindy. His oral wounds started hurting a little bit, then the thought trailed off. Betsy. Yeah, Betsy. He said out loud, though he realized he was horrible at remembering names and even faces sometimes. So he put blood and pain back in their holsters and looked for the assortment of dental kits again. He grabbed more of the clove oil, then found the antibiotics and took one. Took the antibiotics with some of his fresh spring water, then dabbed some of the topical medicine where the pain was bugging him. Ow! Well, that sucks. I wonder how that happened, he wondered. It hurt, but not too bad. He dug around the bag some more and found some Norco Plus. It didn't have... Let's see. It didn't have acetaminophen, only a tiny pill with a ton of painkiller in it. Rico took one of the tiny pills and recalled this was the new painkiller that was non-addictive that the pharmaceuticals had been working on for the military. Didn't require a prescription, but didn't matter because it was military only since they could make a ton of it. It reduced swelling and helped promote healing more as well. It was the new drug for gunshots and stuff, but Rico figured if it was good enough for gunshots, it was good enough for teeth magically disappearing. He was sure the tooth used to be there. It was still raw. Maybe he lost it and didn't realize it, or the tooth fairy came and stole it. He vowed that if he ever saw the tooth fairy, he would give her the what for. The pain pill started to kick in, and up Rico hopped to go on his daily adventure, trying specifically to chew on the safer parts inside his mouth. He stuffed his cowboy hat in his other cargo pocket and put on his helmet and protective jacket, set his daily gallon tea jar outside, grabbed his fully charged drone backpack and phone, and off he went. Chapter 12. Sign of the Times. Rico bumbled down the road pedaling as well as he could. Out of the corner of his eye, he was sure he saw a tire going the other direction, but ignored the tire. Stupid tires, Rico thought to himself amusingly. Then he realized that the tires weren't really hurting anyone. They just like to roam around and do tire things. I mean, they didn't even really leave tire tracks, so who were they really bothering? Rico shrugged to himself, brushing it off as a little wind or something that covered their tracks probably. Either that or he wasn't paying close enough attention. Rico wanted to look up and see what the buzzards were doing, and then realized he would probably crash and fall into a hole or something if he did that. Probably with his luck, he'd go flying into the watering hole he dug and lose his new bike or something, so he paid close attention until he saw his shovel and slowed down his pedaling for safety. He got off his bike and checked his battery charge, and it was almost full, so the pedaling situation worked really well for charging. He hung up his lightly armored coat and helmet and put on his cowboy hat. It was time to get to work. Oops, before that, he remembered to eat some more of his breakfast blend and drink a bunch more water, so he did. Rico would unzip the bag and tilt it up and dump it in his mouth. It was always fun to do. Then he kicked himself for not bringing a little personal water purifier with him. Rico was sure he had a little travel water purifier already. He remembered to do that tomorrow. Rico set down his backpack and took his gloves off for a second to use his delicate equipment. He told his drone to launch and see what else was around. It could go for about 10 minutes or so. He told it to do a larger pattern scan to see what it could see, then come back and charge. He'd let the drone charge a bit and then send it off for a follow-up, specifically to anything interesting it might have spotted. With the push of a button, off the drone went to go map areas it hadn't mapped yet, but in a wider pattern to spread out how much it could get done on a single charge. With the drone buzzing off, Rico threw his worker gloves back on and grabbed his shovel. After shuffling off the plywood from his new watering hole, he admired the sparkling clear water, reflecting a cowboy hat back at him. Well, he wasn't a cowboy yet. He dug through his cargo pocket and pulled out his cowboy hat and posed for the water pit he'd successfully made. Then pulled his neckerchief up to get to work. Rico looked at the hole, then looked back to where the house was, looked at the water hole in the direction of the house. He imagined where it was, and then realized the bike marks he was making were a good enough path to follow. Rico thought for a second and realized the shovel wasn't going to work, and stabbed it back in the dirt, and then jumped on it for good measure, his military boots stomping into the shovel sturdily. Rico looked around for a second before finding his pickaxe tossed aside, a bush slowly turning green, trying to reclaim it. "Mine!" Rico exclaimed as he wrestled the mattock from the sagebrush. It seemed to give him a look as if it was finders keepers and that the bush was smarter than he was. Rico squinted judgmentally back at the clump of grankly grass with a humph. Straddling the impromptu bike lane Rico had been making, he started carving away at the dirt little by little, not connecting it with his watering hole until it was done. As he smashed, picked, and pulled away at the dirt, trying to take the most direct approach, he wondered how long it was to his ancient artifact fossil of a garden. As he chipped away a foot at a time, he thought maybe it was a quarter of a mile. He lost track of time every time he traveled from point A to point B, but wasn't sure why. Chipping away 1 foot of earth led to 10 and eventually 20. He tried to do a straight line as best as he could. It was only maybe a few inches deep, but he could always do more later once he was sure the water wouldn't take on a mind of its own. Eventually he couldn't see his bike very well anymore, or the shovel, and turned around to look towards his house. He could sort of imagine where it was, and saw now the multiple-timed bike tire treads heading that basic direction. He dug away a few more feet of earth, then decided it was time to stop for water and some more of his breakfast chow. There was enough left for a few more mouthfuls when he got bumped into from behind. He hadn't really heard anything that sounded like footprints, but thought he imagined some gravel grinding. When he spun around, there was nobody there, then looked down. A tire wanted to cross the ditch he was making. Rico moved out of the way, and the tire resumed its travel, and Rico shrugged. He'd have to figure out a little bridge or something so the tires could roll over his ditch he was making so they wouldn't get upset. The last thing he needed was a bunch of pissed-off tires unable to get to where they needed to go. Rico finished off his water and crumpled the bottle back into his pocket and then began digging again. In the distance, a tire was going the other direction and was having fun hopping over the ditch like it was a new game to play. Rico didn't even bother looking up at the tires anymore. They were going to do whatever they were going to do. He saw the off-road tire playing in his peripheral, but just ignored it, as long as the tires were happy. Pick, pick, pick. Rico picked away at the ground foot by foot, until he felt like he was about at the halfway mark, then decided it was a good time to get his motorbike in case he needed it for any emergency-type reason. He trotted along his little ditch he'd been digging step after step until he could see the shovel and his bike in the distance. Somewhere behind him, a tire hit the ditch at full speed and went flying, getting tons of air. Rico shook his head and kept walking, finding little spots to pick out where there was a rock or a root ball partially in the way. Eventually, he got back to his watering hole and sat down for lunch. Rico started snacking on his lunch mix and wishing he had more water to drink. He looked in his watering hole, and it looked clear enough. Rico kneeled over and swished the water around for a little bit. It was crystal clear. Not that he could see microscopic parasites or anything, but it looked like clear mountain water. It even smelled clean. Rico shrugged and filled up his water bottle. What's the worst thing that could go wrong? As if someone from above would smite him for challenging fate. He looked around to see if there was a deer that was snickering from just pooping in his water hole. There was no such deer, thankfully. In fact, he looked around and there wasn't really any animals at all. He knew where he could reliably see life, though, and looked up. There were the buzzards that followed him around all day waiting for him. Not today, buzzards! He shook his fist at them, but on the inside he was glad that they were there. Without them, there'd be no signs of life anywhere around here. Where had all the life gone? He wondered. A thought slowly phased in, but he couldn't grasp it. It was repeating two diametrically opposed poles, two extremes. He felt pulled in either direction, but was stuck in the middle. And then a word flowed through the fog. Chapter 13, Purgatory. Rico shrugged the thought away before it could maintain a foothold. He wouldn't give up fighting. Plus, he was having too much fun. Sure, there was adversity, but it wasn't too bad. There seemed to be a grand design. This Joe guy that kept mailing him stuff seemed to have everything planned out. That meant there must still be a plan. As long as there was a plan, Rico wouldn't give up, even in this apparent wasteland. So he munched on his lunch blend of crackers and various rice cereals, all salty instead of savory, just the way he liked it. Peppered throughout there were miniature chocolate candies and roasted peanuts. Everything a growing boy needed to work throughout the day. The salt pained his mouth at first, but then started making it feel even better. Another gulp of water, and it was time for a refill in his makeshift well. At this rate, he could finish the first iteration at his ditch before sundown. Then he realized he felt like he was missing something, forgetting something. Rico looked around and saw his little beehive-style backpack on the ground with the drone inside nearly back at full charge. A solar panel on top gathering sunlight as an auxiliary to the standard charging port. Finishing up his lunch snack, Rico pulled up his phone to see what all had been mapped. It was as he suspected. Everything around him was barren, and this was the only spot that had a high chance for water. Indifferent to the whole situation, having nothing real to go on, Rico sent the drone out again, towards the ridgeline. The drone had stopped only just before the ridgeline, and Rico figured it couldn't hurt anything. The parameters for the drone range allowed it to be set at a cone where it could record the ridge and make it back, as long as there was no real wind issues or anything. Rico looked around and didn't see any wind, so he figured good enough as far as he could control. With the push of a few buttons, the drone popped back out and headed towards the ridge with its new orders. A warning across the screen that it wasn't actually at full charge was missed. as Rico put the phone away before the calculations had completed and notification displayed. Without another thought, Rico hopped on his motorbike with his jacket and helmet on and putted back to the end of his ditch. He would pedal later. He wanted to save his energy for the remainder of the day's work to be done. He pickaxed away for what seemed like hours, and probably was. Upon having his modest homestead in view, it renewed his energy, and he finished the path to his desolate garden with vigor. Wiping the sweat from his brow, he refilled his water bottle and then set to head back to the watering hole to finish the last little notch that would stream the water down to the homestead overnight for him to work on in the morning. It sparked a thought really fast, though, and he dug an impromptu pit really fast with the pickaxe and filled it with all the loose gravel he could find. Later he would try to dig a deeper hole or make a fish pond or something. He wasn't exactly sure. Of course, there was no actual fish for him to make a pond for, but oh well. It was the thought that counted, right? He looked towards the house and saw it was an incline so the water wouldn't flood his house or anything. Rico nodded in satisfaction that it worked out as well as it did. With analysis and work complete, Rico hopped back onto his motorbike and half under engine power and half pedaling to pass the time, scooted along the 2-mile stretch or whatever it was of empty ditch to his watering hole. Maybe it was closer to 1.5 miles. Rico couldn't remember. Upon returning to the watering hole, the sun was trying to set. He had maybe half an hour or so of daylight. He wasn't sure. Plenty of time. Rico reached down for his pickaxe and realized he'd left it at the house. That's okay. The shovel was still there. He shoveled, poked, and prodded away at the half-foot of dirt and gravel until a little bit of a trickle gave way. Rico thought for a second and gave it a little more space to flow, and away it went. A tiny little stream. Almost like the fuse being lit. If the fuse was water. Rico stabbed the shovel in the ground and saw the drone back on the ground. He went to pick it up, but no drone. The drone had always come back. What gives? Rico checked his phone to see if maybe it left some kind of message. On the screen was several warning messages. He swished by to get a look at the map. A bleeping red marker of a last known location on his map around 100 yards away. He could walk it, but he didn't want to get lost, and it was turning to dusk as the sky turned different beautiful colors every few minutes, and with every few minutes the temperature dropped 2 more degrees. A small ounce of panic hit his stomach, because he didn't want to ride his bike and plow over the drone somehow. The map said the beacon was accurate within a few feet. Rico bit back his fear, hopped on his bike with no helmet so he could see. The visor that protected his eyes was fogged to reduce glare and protect identity, but it was hindering his vision. He rubber webbed the helmet to the cage on the back of his bike along with the drone's backpack and puttered along, holding his phone between the handlebars. Rico rumbled along slowly, half pedaling, half motoring as he got closer. 100 yards felt like a mile, with all the bumps and switches he had to be cautious of, and it kept getting darker. A new wave of anxiety, stronger this time. The darkness, no moon. It was going to be so dark. So dark. The thought trailed off and echoed in his mind. He fumbled around with the button, mashing, trying to find out how to activate the motorcycle's powerful LED headlight. It would drain his battery, but he needed it, having no flashlight other than the tracker-free app that activated the flash function on his phone as a light. After a few button mashing attempts, he got the light on, but the lighting was red at dusk levels. Any attempt at casting light was almost completely washed out and would be useless until dark. His phone said he was getting closer and closer to the beacon. 25 yards, 20, 10. He slowed down and got off the bike, headlight shining now into near darkness, looking for some kind of emergency read beacon or something like that. He reminded himself this was the last known good location, not where it was. It could be closer out, or further, or in pieces. Then a thought crossed his mind. Someone could have taken the precious drone. He searched for tire tracks. What if it was someone on a quad, or something saw it flying around and wanted to take it? There were drone thieves out there, or people who simply hated drones for being invasive or were possibly anti-military tech tinfoil hat wearing neckbeards. The thought made him shudder in a half-sarcastic gesture. Rico searched on the drone app for his phone for some kind of alert function or battery backup. After swishing through the phone app screens as the sun completed its setting process, he found the emergency buttons and mashed them all. He stopped to listen, his heart not even beating, it seemed like, waiting for a sign. There was nothing. The drone wasn't there. Rico made the last few steps until he was right on top of the waypoint the phone had set. As soon as he got on top of it, it triangulated a new emergency position, but the location was moving in real time. Without thinking, Rico turned to face the motorcycle, but couldn't see it, as he saw a blinking light on his phone and then it dimmed. At once he realized his phone had synced as a location on his phone map. He had to hurry. He jogged towards the light as fast as he could, concerned that he would be completely lost in the cold night without his bike. The temperature having already dropped so many more degrees, and Rico starting to get cold, having only moments earlier been standing idly. Rico hopped on the bike and headed towards the next waypoint, the notification saying it only had a minute or two of emergency flight. He was programmed to land safely instead of crashing with its remaining power, then trying to power back up with the tiny solar panels it had built into the top of its frame. The battery backup was barely enough for a beacon in 2 minutes of flight, though, or so. It must have known that the remaining energy wasn't enough to get back, so it stayed put, but something must have got it, or maybe it tried to take off again and the wind took it further off course. Rico didn't know. Maybe the wind was still blowing it around. He didn't feel any wind, though, but he was very focused. Almost tunnel vision, but not quite. Old instincts kept him on track, but not blind to his peripheral. Rico pedaled and pedaled, trying to get energy back into the bike, so he could keep his forward lamp at full power. He was being distracted, though. A halo with a compass heading kept readjusting where he was supposed to be going, and then he heard it in the distance, the big engine that he had heard before on the road. Was he near a road and didn't realize it? Rico was concerned he could fly right into a ditch at any moment for some reason and slowed down and then stopped. Rico froze and turned his light off, unsure of what to do. He didn't see any headlights. Maybe they knew this area well or drove around with military night vision tech or something. He thought for a second and couldn't think of a military training base or anything nearby. No reason for the military or even private contractors to be operating anywhere near here in an official capacity. His eyes had become unfocused, and the drone quickly altered path and headed towards him as the louder engine noise felt like it was getting closer and closer. As if willing himself to evade potential capture, Rico's imagination took over in the pitch-black darkness. He turned his bicycle around and started pedaling away. He would try to find the drone in the morning if he could. Hopefully the drone would have enough energy saved for a final beacon burst, or maybe there'd be some clues. Either way, Rico was out of there, and pedaled off into the night until he couldn't hear the engine anymore. As he pedaled through the darkness, pitching dangerously back and forth, trying not to wipe out, he kept having brief flashbacks of a winding road and crash. Every time he imagined himself crashing and being fatigued, the memory would jolt him back into being awake and alert as he kept pedaling as fast as he could safely go. Almost crashing and burning a few times. Once he'd gone a few hundred yards in what he felt like it was the correct direction, he turned his forward lamp back on and checked his phone. Behind him, the drone flew in with a barely discernible low hum and clamped onto the drone backpack with the subtlety audible magnets activating to secure the device. Rico pedaled back to his homestead as fast as his legs would go, readjusting accordingly to the phone that had reset the waypoint too. It guided him around the worst bumps, but didn't stop him from rocking around from settling boulders. There was enough power left in his bike, though, to keep steadying him instead of sending him off, flying to bump his head on a rock or something. Before long, he saw his ditch filling with water and followed its reflection home. He got to his door, unlocked it like he had so many times without thinking. Then he shoved his bike inside and powered the light off. went back out, grabbed his tea jar, and sat back down on the kitchen floor like he had so many times before. After a few big gulps of his chamomile tea, a friend of his had preferred for so long, his nerves started to calm down and the pain pill started to wear off. He dug for a new one and popped it in, not out of habit, but to knock the pain out so he could sleep here in a bit when it fully kicked in. He drank more of his gallon tea and relaxed more, the tea filling in the gaps of his mouth, soaking into the gauze, relieving the pain and swelling more. He looked around, slightly groggy, and took a few bites of his lunch blend they had left over in his pocket. Rico steadied himself on the counter and hoisted himself up, dizziness threatening to take over. He'd had this idea of plugging the bike into the inverter to get it charged up to full power in case there was another emergency. The Beehive drone backpack was still sitting in the cage along with the helmet, the drone now back in its inset, charging through the juncture. The battery on the pack showing it was also less than half, the drone's battery indicator blinking red. Rico plugged in the pack, the bike, and his phone all to the inverter and checked the charge controller. His battery was at full power, and at a glance, the water tank's charge controller showed the water was hot and ready to go. Rico nodded at the hot water tank and decided he was long overdue for a shower. His pants and shirt could go weeks without a washing, but those undies had to go. He tossed his dirties in an empty commercial-grade mop bucket and brought a clean pair with him that he'd been hanging up on the clothesline in his greenhouse of sorts. It hadn't had plants in it for years or longer, and it was his laundry room now. Some homemade soap he traded from a friend sat in the top of the heavy-duty yellow mop bucket where he did his laundry. Same soap he used in the shower. Oh well, who's ever gonna know? Clean was clean, or whatever. After the shower, he threw all of his clothes back on, along with his clean undies, and passed out on the kitchen floor in his cowboy hat. As he drifted off to sleep, he was trying to recall if the drone had been in the pack all along, and if he was chasing a ghost. Or maybe it was the other way around. He checked the map in the morning, after the drone synced with his phone, and see what it said it had been up to. Chapter 14, Discovery. Rico woke up with a start as the daily bonk on the door proclaimed packages arrived, and Rico instinctively clamored for his phone. He wanted to go throw up at the thought of how much of a damn virus the world had become all of a sudden. Up had become down, and left had become right. He tried to shake the thoughts out of his head of how many ethnicities and religions had been persecuted, while others enjoyed their magic-protected bubbles. All the while, the protected so-called minorities acted like they were the least protected, and continued attacking the actual minorities using the excuse that they were invincible. As Rico barely crawled outside in time to dry heave, he remembered the word projection. He knew someone who had tried to show everyone the truth, had to try to show everyone what was really going on. The wolves had been running the hen house or whatever. The chicken had got before the cart, and the kettle was calling itself every color but the one it actually was. He closed his eyes and saw a book made of skinned faces, a book made by the worst demon of them all to confuse everyone. Every few months or years the page would change, the skin face would change, but the hate never changed. It was always the same hate. It changed who it hated, but it was always the same hate. People were so blind. Tiny ideas became bipolar. In unity they fed hate. In coexistence they fed hate. In solidarity they fed hate. In anti-hate they became hate. Rico heaved again. He wished he could talk to Joe, but he couldn't. He didn't know how to get a hold of Joe. There was no phone number or address, only memories. Rico needed to keep going. That's what Joe would want. Rico clambered back into the house to shut the door and checked his phone. He set the phone down for a second and realized what he wanted. Rico dug around through the drawers until he found some cans of Pixie Up, which was a fizzy citrus drink that was popular to calm stomach issues. Some more digging revealed some low-salt buttery crackers that weren't in their pack anymore. Couldn't remember what their name was or even guess on an expiration date. Didn't matter. Down the hatch they went, along with some citrus drink. There wasn't any caffeine, only pure citrus flavor that started calming his stomach instantly, and the crackers helped the nerves. He cursed the anti-haters, accusing everyone else of hating all the time. They tanked all the good movies and video games and plastic bags and soda bottles and straws and self-defense, and then they came for pro-Western culture. Joe didn't tolerate it, and neither would Rico, who would live and thrive regardless of whatever was going on around him. A check to the phone and a lot of scrolling and zooming out got the focus of his map to the hill. It looked more like a cliff face when he went into 3D mode. Some zooming and creative scrolling made it look an awful lot like the thought trailed off. He punched in the command for analysis mode, and the overlay confirmed what he thought. There were caves leading into a network system. Rico couldn't believe it. It had been there all along. He'd been able to buy this place cheap because a past president had nullified it all being federal land, and that was why. Miles and miles away was a federally protected historical indigenous cave system. That's when Federico decided he was going to dig up his irrigation ditch a little bit after checking on it, then start working on that cave. What else was there to do, after all? Maybe there'd be clues as to the history of this area that he could learn from. Probably better prepare. It was decided. That was the plan. After breakfast and packing up some more items, he was ready to go. Rico dug up the little area at his local water pit that had started filling up so it could start irrigating his old garden areas. Rico completely locked up, which he never did, but he had a weird feeling. In his little basket, he packed his daily tea jar and a pack with a few days of provisions and his pickaxe. He'd get his shovel on the way and had a few gallon bags of breakfast and lunch mix just in case. A look around his homestead as the sun rose showed the prior plants around his garden slowly being resurrected. The spots where there was nothing, he threw in a few heirloom seeds for good measure and tapped them in for safekeeping. The water paths he dug had leached into the garden overnight, and he nodded and smiled. It was time to go. Chapter 15, Adventure. With all his gear in his basket or on his back, and fully charged electronic equipment, Rico set off to the wild beyond. Half pedaling and half motoring, he headed into the rising sun. His helmet's anti-glare protection shielded his eyes from the morning rays, and he puttered along passing tires and tumbleweeds, going about their morning routines. The seeming predetermined lines that were on didn't disrupt Rico's route, though, and he made sure to not interrupt any of their morning business. Predetermined paths. Predetermined. There we go. Rico rode on for what seemed like half an hour, listening to the air zipping by his head, and thought about some music. There was a headphone jack and speakers in his helmet that would work perfectly. He decided against it, though, and he wanted to be able to listen for that big truck if it seemed to come around again. When Rico would get up on a slightly higher mound than the rest, he'd stop for a quick break to look around, but saw or heard nothing. The sun in the sky indicated that possibly an hour or so had passed. The buzzards still stalked him overhead like an all-seeing eye, but seemed to be watching him less like food and more like a reality TV show or a daytime soap opera. By the phone's estimate, he was a little over halfway there and could reach the cliff face within an hour at his current pace. That's all he needed to know, and off he puttered. More pedaling than motoring got him to the cliff face before lunchtime, and the indicator on his bike showed him he had managed to save quite a bit of his battery reserves. The cliff face seemed to go on several meters straight up, although it was impossible to really tell from this perspective. As if more of his new routine, Rico told the drone to go map the caves and let him know what it found. He checked all of his messages this time, and it told the drone to only use 75% power to make sure it could return safely. The drone complied, and off it went as Rico pushed his bike up an ancient stone ramp and up into the cave face. After several more stories of ramps, there was an outcropping of sorts that jutted out from the rest of the cliff face, as if it was a deck of some sort. Rico went in a few of the caves and popped his head back out again as a reference until he found the entrance to that area. He sent his backpack He set his backpack out there and unfolded some portable solar panels and plugged everything in. He also had an external antenna he plugged in that would strengthen his communication with the drone as well as other radio devices. Rico set out his tea on the side also as the sun crested the vertex, creating direct line of sight with the balcony. The travel solar panels activated and the tea began to cook, and Rico was happy. Digging through more of his boxes, he found one with a 45-degree clip-on flashlight and clipped it. It was still dark, though, even after turning on the light, and he remembered that his helmet was still on. So he hung the helmet off his bike and affixed his cowboy hat proper. The light shone bright, but with the helmet off, Rico decided to let his eyes adjust instead. As his eyes readjusted, the light slowly directly illuminated the cave face and began pushing its way outside the dense network of cave tunnels. Rico was currently in a room that seemed like a bedroom of sorts, complete with a stone slab for a bed location, a personal fireplace, and a hygiene area. None of it had been used in hundreds of years, but there was still charcoal in the fireplace. It was cozy, yet it felt very welcoming, like he was supposed to be here. He took his backpack off, complete with his overnight gear, just in case, and set it on the stone slab. The stone was cold, of course, but kept one's self off the drafty floor. His bike parked in the corner with a stand down nice and out of the way. Sun illuminated more of the tunnels as it became more angled properly. It was a good time for Rico to eat. Chapter 16, Strange Depths. During eating, the drone had found its way back and hooked into its base, being close enough to get a signal to Rico's phone. Much of the inner workings of the cavernous living space was now documented. The drone estimated it was 33% complete with a 76% margin of error due to the multitudes of scouting variabilities. Rico shrugged and tried his radio and cell one more time. Neither got a signal, even with the external radio antenna he put up, so he powered down his radio and put his phone back in Wi-Fi mode. Rico opened back up the map software for the drone and programmed in for the drone to do 2 more sweeps once it was charged, and then called it a night. He tried to estimate how much power that would leave the main pack, considering the charge it would get throughout the day, and hoped it would have about a quarter power left. That would give him a little emergency power in case he stayed the night, and knowing he couldn't really charge it for a third of the day's cycle from this location, he'd be able to do one last sweep tomorrow, based on whatever the drone was able to find. That'd have to be good enough to where he would have to head home to his bigger battery and solar panels. The map indicated some coal stores, which would keep him warm for the night. He set out to that first and put some coal in a little coal cache next to his fireplace, and then wiped his hands off and looked at the phone again. There were some icons indicating what he guessed were cave drawings, some pottery, and maybe an old garden or something, so that's where he went next. Rico walked as far as the sun's angle was able to reach in from the sky, and then turned on his clip-on flashlight. There were cave drawings everywhere, chronicling the entire history of the civilization that lived in these caves. There was a great migration over an ice bridge, apparently. The tribes broke off as they traveled south. Some stayed and learned how to live in the snow. Others learned how to live in the forest. These people learned how to live in caves. More traveled to the south, being nomads or building their own huge stone structures and the designs of the ancient pyramids. Rico followed the ancient picture texts as everything seemed to be going fine for a while and everything was prosperous. They learned how to get water from the ground for hydration and plants, and found coal for easy fire making. On the ground, Rico stepped over some ancient coal carvings and scooted them over to a corner where he wouldn't step on them, and then continued reading. He was so enthralled that he felt like he had to see this through to the end, and he started focusing on the wall art to see where he left off when the drone whizzed by his head, presumably to go dock again. Rico shrugged and kept reading. The tribe liked to do art, obviously, and they liked to garden. The art depicted ceiling gardens, where the plants would collect the water vapor and keep the caves dry. It would also keep the bugs and critters off, and the bats apparently helped to take care of the plants also. Rico looked up, but it was all stripped clean. There were still places to hang pots, but the rest was gone for unknown reasons. There was a sort of diverging story at this point where people were depicted growing special plants and bugs. Rika took a picture of this so he would remember to come back later. The main story continued that everything was going fine, and water came back and the plants started to grow really well. Everyone seemed to be prospering when some sort of plague came. A plague or swarm. Rico wasn't sure. The cave drawings sort of trail off at that point. A loud humming came from very far away and reverberated through the cave walls, and Rico scrambled out as safely as he could to see what was going on. Chapter 17, Revelations 1. In his head, he imagined the pickup truck that chased him from the hybrid vehicle when he went to collect his battery, and again it tried to take his drone. There was no such truck, though, as when Rico got out to the balcony, all he saw was a swarm of large insects that traveled as if they were a cloud of death. A pack of coyotes ran desperately from the cloud and looked like they were going to get away when one appeared slightly injured. It appeared to have stepped on a briar or something of similar injury and was in agonizing pain, trying to run for dear life. Within seconds, the swarm was on the tortured pup, and the merciless flies consumed it. In moments, there was no discernible features left of the canine, but the others were able to escape. The killer flies seemed to be distraught and unsatisfied and fanned out to search. What little vegetation was around disappeared as they ate everything in their search. Rico recoiled in horror at the realization nothing was left because of these flies. His arm had got stung by one of these flies. The flies had chased him back to his house from collecting the battery. The flies had probably accidentally carried off his drone trying to attack it. He looked down and now recognized the second layer of telltale slime of bug guts from the drone's battle with the fly on the window so many days earlier. The drone had been fighting with the flies, trying to defend itself, and ran out of batteries. Rico slumped down in defeat, hoping the flies were too far away to smell him and find him. What could he honestly do? He wondered in exasperation. The drone couldn't fight them off. If he started a fire, it might only attract them or buy him temporary time. He didn't have a shotgun with birdshot or anything, and he'd need a couple hundred rounds to even have a chance. They'd easily be on him before that, and nothing around here ate them in any reasonable capacity. The thought trailed off in Rico's mind. He flipped through his pictures and noticed the piece of cave wall depicting the flies and special plants that the locals grew. With new ground vigor, Rico jumped up with his light on and ran back into the cave as the sun hung low in the afternoon sky. Following the map on his phone, he quickly navigated the tunnels. Upon first glance, he noticed the drone had unloaded tons of new cave tunnel areas, but was still nowhere near mapping at all. The new estimate was that it would take months to get near 100%. Rico didn't have months, though. He only had days, if not hours. His only hope was that these plants may still exist somehow. He knew, though, that they were not only extremely unlikely that he would find these plants in abundance, but that they even existed at all. It could have been a metaphor, or maybe hope, wish, or prayer, or a dream. He was undeterred, though, and began where he finished off at the side story on the wall. The best Rico could figure out, there was the swarm, and a guy leading the swarm with a bug mask over his face. Rico couldn't figure out if it was a symbol or literal, but kept reading. The tribe rose up to fight the usurper, but he snuck into their cave and destroyed all the plants that protected them. Rico recalled the smashed pottery outside each inlet of the cave. Had there been plants at each entrance protecting them somehow, figuratively or otherwise? Rico would only know if he kept reading. The usurper gathered his loyal followers and attacked the cliff colony at night, destroying the plants. The bugs followed after, eating everyone in the hanging gardens alive. Rico kept reading, but it trailed off there. Another direction the story went into detail about how exactly the flowers in question were grown, and another of how the pots were created. According to the pictographs, it was a special flower with a special seed, which required special dirt and special pots. This plant was very particular, apparently. Rico took pictures with his phone as he went, making sure to not miss anything. The drone had mapped most of these locations, so Rico was starting to piece together that this was very real. There was a pottery-making location, a seed bank, a place where they seemed to dig dirt, and more. Rico was able to get all the recipes he needed except where to find the seeds. When he checked the seed bank, it had been raided and appeared to have been burned to near ash. No seeds of any type were spared. That wouldn't deter Rico either, though, and he dusted off the area where the tribe used to make pots and proceeded to gather the instructions on the wall to make a pot that would fit on the back of his motorcycle. It couldn't be too thick or too thin. It had to have a bunch of holes about an inch up from the bottom. There had to be gravel on the bottom so the roots could breathe. So Rico moved all the ingredients into the bedroom where he was staying and checked inside. To his relief, the flies were all gone. The drone detached and flew past him back into the caves to do its final sweep per Rico's queued up instructions. Rico took a strike anywhere match from his pack and a variety of fire starters. Rico never knew which one to use, since they all started different and lasted varying amounts of time, so he took one of each and stuck them together and put them in the fireplace. First strike of the match and it snapped in half. Rico sighed under his breath. Second strike of the match and it snapped right below the head. Rico sighed again. He took both pieces and set them on a fire starter as that tiny bit extra, along with the extra cardboard packaging. He didn't need any more from the loot he hauled over. Then he shuffled the coal around a little bit more and got 2 more matches. The cardinal rule is if you can't get a fire starter with 3 matches, you suck and don't deserve a fire. So with the second match, he struck it and the ignition head went flying off, which made it basically impossible to start. He set it in the fire as well and shrugged. It always took the third match anyway. Rico struck the third match and it started right up. He covered the baby flame with his hand and tried not to breathe, letting the fire climb up the matchstick, but not so much it would burn him. He could tell it wanted to, though, and slowly moved it to his pile of fire starters. Rico set the match on the fire starter bundle as the tiny bit of flame crept along the matchstick. The first piece of fire starter, which was sort of a log-looking turd, ignored the flame. The second seemed to like it, though, and the marshmallow-looking blob instantly caught flame and ignited the third, which looked like a cookie. The blob and cookie eventually got hot enough to ignite the turd, and before long that made the coal happy, and it lit up also. Rico moved in another piece of coal from his coal stash and started mashing up the clay he had found. The sun began to set. Chapter 18, The Craft. Rico had brought a huge lump of clay he had found in the wall, and began kneading and pinching it together almost like dough. Eventually it became a ball shape, and then he started flattening and shaping the clay out to what the picture showed on his phone. After a while of that, the sun had set, and by the fire's glow, the pot began to take shape. After Rico got what he thought was the shape and design that was close enough, he pushed the pottery drying contraption near the fire. Rico set his new pot on the spinning sort of a thing and looked at the instructions. Apparently you set the turbine over the fire and the heat spun it, which twisted the pot and dried it at the fireplace. Rico shrugged and did as the instructions indicated. While still soft and before spinning, Rico took out his multi-tool and poked in some holes where he thought they should go, about an inch up from the base and a few inches apart. For the width, he wasn't sure. He took out one of his revolvers and popped the cylinder and took out a bullet. Pretending to shove the bullet in it, he got the basic shape and size that he wanted. He put his bullet in his gun back on his belt, and poked his holes as the pot began to slowly rotate. Within a few moments, the device was spinning at a pretty decent pace. The room heated as the 3.5 or so gallon pot evenly distributed the heat as it cooked. Any cold chill that was trying to grip Rico instantly departed as the centuries-old work instructions worked as they had on the first day that they were created. With the pot baking for a few hours, Rico needed to go get dirt, but he didn't have anything to put the dirt into. He wished for his wheelbarrow, but it was on the other side of a swarm of killer flies. A brief shock pulsed through Rico. What if there was more than one swarm? That was enough for him. Leaving was out of the question. He looked around for a basket or something to bring the dirt back, but there was nothing. Rico dug through his pack and found an extra stuffed sack that looked like it would hold the dirt as well as a folding trowel. With both, he shoved another coal brick into the fire and sauntered off. On the way to getting the special dirt he needed, he passed a final set of wall instructions again. There was a piece missing. He went to the dirt area as indicated by his phone map and collected the dirt with a stuffed sack and folding trowel, trying to figure out if there were any more instructions. He decided to take a different route back with his several pounds of dirt and tiny shovel in his back pocket. The story repeated in his mind. They attacked at night. There was a battle once. The plant sentries were taken out. But where was the last holdout? Rico figured it was somewhere deep inside, likely some kind of dead end. Last stand sort of a deal. He reminded himself to check the dead ends on his phone map once he returned with the dirt. Rico headed back and the drone went flying down an adjacent hallway with a kersplat as it hit a fly at full speed. Chapter 19. The Chase. Rico picked up the pace and followed the drone back with his dirt. The dirt bag was blocking his flashlight mostly, and following the drone back would make it easier. It might just be time to end the night here, he figured. In trying to keep up with the drone, though, Rico got turned around. He stopped checking his phone and had lost which way the drone went. Then he had a thought. Maybe the drone wasn't heading back. Had he just been led deeper into the labyrinth? Rico stopped to think for a second and sat down his bag of dirt, his mouth throbbing from the blood pressure. He checked his phone, and the drone wasn't too far off. There was a choice in his head between figuring out what the drone was doing and heading back. It was a choice he didn't have to think about for long. He'd been separated from this drone once already, and it stressed him out quite a bit. He wouldn't let it happen again. Throwing the stuff sack's strap over his shoulder to lug the dirt bag on his back, he could see well with his flashlight again. It was on medium power, and the instructions said, before he tossed them into the fire, was that this thing on medium power could go for about 5 hours. It would need to recharge soon, and while rechargeable flashlights weren't the most reliable, it beat throwing away battery when restocks weren't available. Rico turned the few more corners as the phone directed, and there was the drone. It was staring at a wall. Not so much a wall exactly as a collapsed hallway. Rico checked his map and saw the problem. The drone had run into an error and some warnings. According to everything he mapped out, the cave-in was an anomaly, so it took a longer scan to analyze. The progress bar showed 33%, so there would be a few minutes. Rico hit the button to halt the program after the scan, and report was complete. A confirmation let him know it understood the command. With a few minutes to spare, Rico started looking around and knew why the cave art had stopped. This had been their final stand. Some hastily drawn paintings showed the last few warriors in the hallway fighting, but overcome not from the human enemies, but the flies. Rico looked at the floor, and there were the last few smashed pots, and Rico understood. The brave warriors grabbed the last few pots and held out here. It was supposed to be their escape, but it had been sealed off somehow. Some kind of explosion went off or something. On his phone, scrolled through low-level readings of faint traces of gas. Maybe a torch lit something off, Rico wasn't sure. Upon getting to the end of the wall's history lessons, Rico took a few more pictures and realized a piece was missing. Something had definitely been written on the wall, but it was gone. Rico backtracked and realized that the victors I tried to deface the fact that these remaining holdouts had the last seeds. They'd got some seeds and retreated to maybe try to fight another day. Rico wasn't sure. A piece was missing, though. The drone completed its scan and then flew sideways to a wall and clamped onto it, walked a few steps, walked around in a circle, and then powered down to a standby level. The remainder of the reporting filled Rico's phone as the drone idled on the wall with a faint red light pulsing. Rico scrolled by what he already saw, including the gas and what the stone was made out of. There was more, though. The drone had not only identified the partial collapse, but detected a deceased victim underneath. That gave Rico an idea. As he put his phone to sleep and shoved it in his pocket without looking at the battery level, his flashlight also dimmed imperceptibly as it was running out of juice. Ignoring all of this as if he had a choice, Rico got out his little foldable survival trowel and started digging as best as he could. After getting the main slab of stone off, there were more tiny stones than a skeleton, along with another smaller busted pot and dirt scattered. A tiny dry husk of a plant laid underneath, root ball still intact. Rico said a quick prayer and moved the skeleton to see a tablet underneath and a fully intact tiny sack. Nothing bigger than what could maybe hold some marbles. The skeleton still had a firm grip on the sack as if this was the most important thing in the world. Rico flipped the tablet over and snapped a picture. It was getting too dark for him to see the detail, but the phone could pick up the light no problem. After making sure his phone saved the picture, he hit snooze on the phone and grabbed the sack this brave soul had sacrificed his life to save. He was super careful to not break any bones or disrupt the skeleton's hand more than he had to, and was successful. A last spur-of-the-moment thought prodded Rico to carefully grab the delicate husk of a plant and put it in the dirt bag where it would hopefully be safe for later study. The flashlight was almost out of power, and he carefully made his way across the room to the drone and picked up his sack of special dirt. Rico figured he could maybe simply use his flashlight application on his phone, so he woke his phone back up. Well, his phone was almost dead again. He'd been using it and leaving the map application on all day. Didn't exactly help. Rico navigated through the application to reactivate the drone and program it to lead him back home, and the phone powered down with a sad green robot face. Rico sighed and reached out into the near darkness as his flashlight faded and grabbed the drone. With his other hand, he unsnapped his flashlight and held it close to the drone, looking for manual power. A few button mashes later, and the drone had a little overhead LED light that turned on. It was just enough for Rico to see. There'd been another button that was an emergency return home button, but Rico worried it would outrun him and he would be completely lost forever trying to roam in the labyrinth until the flies got him. So he used the LED from the drone to march back by memory. It got darker and darker as the light from the drone got dimmer and dimmer, and Rico started holding the wall as he went, trying to think if he should follow the right wall back or if the left wall would be quicker. He shrugged either way. He figured he'd be lost for days, so he just headed forward. Eventually he saw a faint light in the pitch black, and the temperatures felt a tiny bit warmer. A few more rooms and he knew his bedroom would be right around the corner, and there it was. Chapter 20, Earnings. The warm room welcomed him. The stone was warm, the air was warm. Everything was warm. Rico got another piece of coal from his stash and threw it in the fireplace. According to the instructions, his pot would almost be done baking. He watched it turn a few times and there was no visible cracks. It was turning out pretty much perfectly, but then he remembered and frowned. He hadn't found any seeds and had his dirt and pot, but no seeds. Rico frowned again and took all of his electronics back to the battery pack and started plugging everything in. Within a few moments, the drone, cell phone, and flashlights were all charging. He checked his pockets before he sat down to make sure he wasn't going to sit on anything, and thankfully remembered his shovel. That would have hurt, Rico chuckled to himself, and then remembered his other pocket. An old bag he'd found that the skeleton had been trying to protect. Carefully, Rico tried to parse through the bag in the glow of the firelight. It was closed shut by a strong drawstring, and upon loosening, Rico could feel 3 distinct marble-sized shapes in the bag. Gently he opened the bag and rolled the 3 round shapes onto the floor, almost looking more like grapes than anything. Upon close inspection, the first seemed rotten, and the second was cracked and dry. But the third... The thought trailed off in Rico's mind as his mouth woke up and began intense pain. He quickly fumbled through his medical supplies and took one of his new gen pain pills and his oral medical supplies. Quickly he took the bottle of clove oil and dabbed drops onto a piece of gauze. He counted 1, 2, 3, and then stopped thinking. 4, 5, then carefully rolled it into a burrito and shoved it in his mouth, where it hurt. It burned, then smelled sweet, and then burned more, like acid. "Too much!" Rico exclaimed with a mouthful of burning gauze. 3, it was supposed to be 3, ack, ack, ack. Rico dug for his water and started swishing it around, the water adding to his pain and burning. Careful not to swallow any, he carefully pursed the mixed liquid contents onto his shirt sleeve. About 8 times, and the burning thankfully stopped along with some of the pain. Not as much as if he'd got the correct dose, but on the flip side, at least he wasn't going to instantly drop dead from liver failure tonight. Or so he hoped. His left eyelid twitched. He shrugged it off. Probably nothing. Where was he? What was he doing? Rico looked around as the pain subsided. In his hand was a black and gold seed. It almost reminded him of a dandelion or something, but hard and rolled into a ball. He put it into the back for safekeeping and tossed the other 2, clearly gone, into the fireplace for their final rest. Then he remembered the one he'd found under the skeleton. It had in the dirt. He remembered the dirt ball he'd found under the skeleton. It had an intact root ball, he remembered. Maybe it had still been in the dirt until he disturbed it. It didn't seem dead or rotted. Rico recalled that plants could go into hibernation, but he'd never heard for how long. Probably only over a winter or something at most. It was probably dead, but he would treat it with respect anyway. That skeleton person did die to protect it after all. So Rico opened his bag, and there it was. It looked dead, but it didn't look dead. It wasn't crunchy and crumbly, but it wasn't soggy either. At the end of the root ball there appeared to be some longer roots that almost looked like tentacles. Rico held it in his hands delicately and turned it over a few times. It seemed all there, not damaged at all. Maybe bruised a little bit, but a little bruising didn't kill a plant if it was hibernating. Rico regretted not bringing some of its dirt with him, but he knew he hadn't really had time. He set the little plant back in the dirt and covered its root ball back up and got his leather gloves to take off the pot from being overbaked. Rico carefully set the pot down, half worrying it would somehow hit the floor and explode on impact, but it didn't. The pot was very strong. He swiped through his phone's pictures of the wall instructions a few times and didn't see anything specific. He made sure his phone was plugged in, and then he looked through the wall instructions a few times and didn't see anything specific on when to put the dirt in. Rico thought about it for a second and figured it was okay to start putting the dirt in, so he did. But then remembered he needed some gravel or something first. Rico peered out of the darkness with no flashlights left him, his phone tethered to the charger getting charged. No way he was going to get gravel tonight, but what about the coal? He thought about it for a second. No reason the coal wouldn't work. He gathered up the tiny pieces of coal and started putting them in. A little extra alkaline won't hurt you guys, right? Rico asked the plant. Out of the corner of his eye, the plant may have moved a sliver. Rico wasn't sure. Could have been his eyes playing tricks on him. It'd been a long day after all. Could have been the shadows dancing from the fireplace also. Then he had thought, alkaline was what he'd put in his wound to get it better. Maybe this was all linked. Who knows? So he put some tiny bits and shards of coal on the bottom of the pot, so the plant could breathe through the holes on the bottom that he made. Then he started sifting in the dirt, trying to make some bits airy and some other parts compact. Rico had done this before, but always had varying levels of success, so he tried both methods to try to hedge his bets. With the pot about 2/3 full of dirt, he rested the plant on a hunch. It had some kind of a big bud thing on the end, and Rico had a really weird feeling about this. Sizing up the root ball, he dug a little hole about an inch or so down, which is what the instructions showed. That also lined up with what he'd seen at the last stand. It was resting about an inch into the dirt. Then Rico set the root ball in the dirt and packed it in. The plant seemed to want to stand up on its own weight, but the bud on top seemed to want to hang down a little bit. Not having any sticks or anything to prop it up with, Rico got his antenna, which was being useless right now anyway, and stuck it in the dirt. It had some coils and notches that were perfect for resting the plant's top on, and it rested on the antenna like it was propping itself up. A thought smacked Rico, and he realized the plant would want some water. He reached for a sealed water bottle that he hadn't opened yet, then on a whim, he used the half bottle of well water instead. You probably want some of your own water, don't you? The light from the stove danced on the plant, giving it a sense of motion it didn't have. Not really getting a response, Rico poured half the remaining water on the root ball, then the rest around the ball in a circle to promote the root's expansion. Rico, getting a bit more tired, had an even weirder idea. The plant seemed to be doing well so far. What if he took this a step further? He remembered one of the cave paintings that showed them sacrificing one of the flies to the plant to sort of wake it up or activate it or something. Well, Rico wasn't getting anywhere near those flies without being ready for war, but what he did have was gooey fly guts all over the drone. So Rico got out a stick and smeared killer fly guts all over the stick and brought it over to the plant. Rico looked close at the bud, and it appeared to have lips, similar to how the picture had shown, so he took the bug guts on the stick and rubbed it on the plant's lips. The guts and goo dripped down into the plant's mouth, and it seemed to let out a sigh. It was a tiny sigh, like a baby's sigh. Rico was shocked. Had he just killed it? Was that its final life expiring in front of Rico? He was so upset. Had this all just been for nothing? The plant didn't immediately keel over, but it was being propped up after all. Unsure what to do, Rico resolved to leaving it alone. Last thing he wanted to do was to make the poor plant somehow even worse. He faintly recalled a friend that used to continually make things worse in vain attempts to make them better. Sometimes less is more. You can add, but you can't always take back. It was a weird memory, but Rico remembered this guy overkilling and overthinking everything. He'd try his best and nearly always fail. When he got it right, though, it was basically accomplishing the otherwise unachievable. So Rico would leave the plant alone and scooted it away. At the very least, he could study it and try to figure out what worked and didn't for his little seedling. The seedling. He'd forgot all about it. There was still some clay left on the floor. Rico could smoosh together a second pot. He threw another piece of coal on the fire and got to crafting. Within a few hours, he had another smaller version of the 3.5 or so gallon pot, complete with the appropriate holes. Fresh off the improvised oven, he set it gingerly on the floor, filled it with the remainder of dirt in his bag, and buried the seed in an inch or so down. With the last few drips of local water, he dampened the soil of the seed a tiny bit. Rico set up his bed on the stone slab. A compact blow-up mattress and a little blow-up pillow and a coffin sleeping bag that was good to down about 20 degrees. It was a little too warm for his liner, so he left it in his bag. He hung up his 2 6s on a hanger above him, probably meant for plants, and had one last thought as he looked down at the larger and smaller pot next to each other. I bet both of you want some fresh air, huh? He carefully and quietly set the 2 potted plants out on the stone balcony to cool and get fresh air. And in the morning they would start getting light, even if it wasn't direct. In the distance he heard the faint sound of fly swarm ripping around, eating everything in both plant and animal it could find. Resigning to his fate, he crawled back into bed and zipped up his bag. As a last measure, he zipped up a bug net part over his face. He'd still be able to breathe, but hopefully the bugs couldn't get to him. Hopefully. Chapter 21. Good morning, sunshine. Rico woke up, forgetting where he was for a second, flailing around in his bag. The fire had died down and the sun was rising. He was warm and snug, though, and couldn't really decide if he wanted to get up. Then he remembered his 2 little plant buddies he'd been working on. He flailed around some more until he found the zippers and got himself out of bed. The fire was still going fairly decently, and he kicked in another piece of coal. He had to go to the bathroom like crazy and ran to grab his phone, which was now fully charged. It indicated where the bathrooms were on the map, and he ran to one and relieved himself in a way he hoped wouldn't offend the native ancestors. He remembered the plants again and hurried to the balcony. There they were, a bigger pot and a littler pot, and 2 plants trying to stretch out to see the landscape. They were just a tiny bit short, though. Rico stared in awe as the bigger one, which was maybe only a teenager, at best in plant years, chomped at the little baby one as if it was talking. The littler one seemed to wave and flutter a bit, then chomp back. Little spores or pheromones or something going between the two as sort of a communication, maybe? Rico's tummy, unaware of the situation and hungry, decided to rumble. The 2 plants swung their polka-dot bulbed looking heads around and looked at Rico. This startled Rico, and he almost stumbled backwards and fell down. The tinier one waved its leaves around like a child wanting to be picked up. The older one looked standoffish, like it wasn't very trusting. Rico face-palmed. Unsure of what to do, Rico started talking as he went closer. Hi, I'm Rico. He said his name really slow, as if that mattered. The tinier one started chomping and doing a little dance. The larger one looked at him like he was too trusting, but then started slowly doing the same. If I come near you 2, are you going to bite me? The larger one shook its beak and the smaller one nodded. Great, which one of you is lying? He went to the smaller one and went to pick it up. And as soon as his arm got close, the tiny plant bit his arm. Rico recoiled as he was startled, but thankfully hadn't picked up the plant yet, so he didn't drop it and break the pot. The larger plant danced excitedly and started chomping at Rico. Rico looked down at his arm, and through his long sleeve there was sort of a sucker wound. The smaller plant spit something at the larger plant, and the larger plant seemed to breathe it in. "Aw, little fella, you don't have any teeth. I'm going to call you Sucky. Come here, Sucky." He picked up Sucky and held him tight. The small plant didn't try to bite him again and began dancing back and forth happily. The larger plant started dancing also. "Alright, let's get you up on the ledge here." There were 2 special spots for pots on the ledge that secured them in really well, sort of like little battlements. I guess you guys must be like little turrets or something, huh? Well, up here you can see the whole theater. Have fun. Rico cautiously got the larger of the 2 and set it in the next battlement over. The special platforms seemed to be perfectly spaced to create a bit of an overlapping sweet spot. Their new spots seemed to make the plants very happy, and the larger one opened its mouth and some perfume or something leaked out. Rico could see several dead bug carcasses inside its mouth and realized how it survived all this time. Wow, you guys can, like, digest really, really slow if you want to or something. The thought trailed off with no obvious response. Then, as if the plant had a second to think about it, let out a big patooey, and the larger plant spit the bug shells out all over the savannah. Okay, I've got a name for you. You're going to be named Spitty. Spitty and Sucky. The 2 plants stopped to think about it for a second and then began their little dance once again. The big one with its mouth open. Before long, one of the killer fly scouts came along and landed right in Spitty's mouth. Slam! Crunch! Spitty's mouth closed fast on the fly and immediately got crushed into goo. The plant seemed to grain with ichor oozing out of its mouth. Sucky looked over at Spitty, clearly jealous, and opened its mouth also to emulate. It didn't take too long. Slam! Crunch! Rico whispered to himself, "Great, I've created 2 little monsters." Then went inside to put his 6s back on and started making more pots for his new plant critters. Not before making some coffee and having breakfast first, though. Chapter 22. The Coming Days. It turned out, if you feed the plants, they reproduce quite quickly. It wasn't more than a few days until Rico had Spotty and Dotty and Carnage Asada, which was a plant with 2 buds instead of 1 of the normal single ones. There were more varieties of plants growing every day, but he couldn't tell them apart as well due to some of them being twins or behaving in ways he didn't have words for at the time. The plants would eat a few bugs, and the next morning, when he'd wake up, there'd be little seed pods, in the pots waiting. They'd sit there with their mouths open and eat the killer flies as they'd scout and get too close. And every day they'd get a tiny bit bigger. Rico figured eventually the bugs would realize a gap in his defenses and send everything at him, but then he remembered the ancient texts. They can't take anyone out if they have plants without their helper person. It had got too dangerous for Rico to get water by himself, so he brought his favorite plant with him. Carnage asada would be strapped to the back of his motorcycle and ride with him to keep the bugs away or dead. The most Rico had ever seen Carnage asada was 5 or 6 at a time. He held his mouth open until they all landed and got stuck in chomp. So Rico would wait for the bugs to swarm. The bug swarm to be on one side or the other, and then would zip across the savannah to fill up water or to restock until they could make it back to him in time. As soon as he felt like he had enough of these plants, he was going to plant them at his garden home, and then came up with the perfect plan. The drone eventually got the whole Mesa stronghold mapped. It had found a way to get on top where Rico set up the receiver and antenna for it, and it was able to recharge the other half of the day and scout much more efficiently. This allowed Rico to get more clay and make significantly more pots. As the pots were baking, he would go run supplies back and forth, but his little basket wasn't enough, so he went and got his wheelbarrow and repaired the tire properly. After rigging up more wheels to balance it, he was able to haul a lot back and forth more efficiently as soon as everything got hauled back to his homestead. Thankfully, he was done barely in time, because the flies had finally figured out what he was doing, and one day he was going back for a final walkthrough and they wouldn't leave. They stayed put right smack in the middle of his path, basically on top of his watering hole to water his plants. Instead of being random and bug-like, they seemed to take on more intelligent and problem-solving qualities. Rico knew his time was drawing near. Chapter 23, Showdown. Rico had the plants set up strategically around his homestead in their little pots. It was sort of a maze of sorts, where the killer flies couldn't get to his home or his plants without having to pass through several of the plants. The plants were also able to cover each other if any of them got swarmed. A few had gotten quite alarmingly large, and Rico was glad he was on their side, because a few of them had basically become alligator size and could even hop around a little bit if they didn't like where they were placed. Rico had toyed with the idea of chaining them down, but he didn't want to be perceived as their enemy and didn't want to get chomped by them. They more or less considered him their dad or some such, but he wasn't about to push his luck. So he made sure that a good stream of water was making it to them, and they would open their mouths and collect the killer flies. Unfortunately, Rico looked out, and the swarm was getting bigger and bigger. It was amassing its forces for a big push, obviously aware that Rico was growing a successful garden. It was a big swarm, and it was a hungry swarm. Rico knew he couldn't let it get any bigger. He needed to make a preemptive strike. He knew the swarm liked his drone for some reason, and he couldn't pedal fast enough or even motor fast enough off-road to get rid of it, so he waited for noon, right when the sun would be cresting the far-off mesa. It would give his plants the maximum power and potency. Their mouths were already open, but the pheromones just didn't reach that far with no wind. But Rico knew what he was going to do. Rico popped the drone off the charger backpack and had a few of the plants breathe on it with their attracting mist. This would make his drone extra irresistible. He then sent his drone to manual mode and sent it out to go attract the killer flies again. The drone sped off and Rico dug through his pockets. Upon checking the hybrid vehicle again, he got himself some road flares. There had also been some fuel in the vehicle, which he'd siphoned into throwable bottles. He had a few sitting next to him and brought them out to the edge of his plant perimeter. He dunked each upside down a little bit to soak a bit of the paper towel that was in them. A bit, but not too much. Rico had learned how to do this, working with the clove and gauze routine, healing his mouth. Each bottle had half-soaked paper towels, not enough to start evaporating, but enough to where they'd be ready. Rico silently hoped he didn't go through all this work to blow his hands off. So he went around and found some boards and rocks so he could launch them like a miniature catapult. When he got back, he saw the drone was almost there, so he told the drone to go back and forth a little bit, and the killer flies started following. Then he told the drone to come back at maximum speed. Tens of thousands of huge, fat, murderous flies barreled towards Rico's homestead at full speed. Rico steeled his nerves and set up his bottles on their boards with a crossboard. Rocks lay underneath, with all in parallel, so he could mash the main board and fire the bottles simultaneously. There were long enough boards, too, so they wouldn't all simply fly in his face and explode. He hoped, anyway. There wasn't enough time to really test with a rock, because the flies were coming, and they were coming fast. The drone flew at maximum speed. It was angled down and determined. A few of the faster flies caught up and ran into the rotors. The drone sputtered and spun, but was able to correct itself as bug guts splattered everywhere, but the drone still had 100 yards to go. Rico wasn't sure if the little drone could keep up, but it needed to. He stole a glance behind him, and his formidable plant squad was literally salivating at the thought of what was to come. It was as if they could sense the flies, and they reached out with every ounce of their energy, trying to extend the range of their fly-attracting pheromones. Rico turned as the drone covered the last 50 yards to the edge of his perimeter. He saw the sun's direct light crest the mesa wall. The beam seemed to chase the advancing now millions of killer flies. The sun was fast, but the bugs were faster. What was in shadow before was now clear as day. Within the bug swarm there were several humanoid figures. The one in the lead adorned a bug mask to the likes which Rico had never seen. As the sun directly illuminated the savannah, he lost count at around 15 guys. He patted his 2 6-shooters. Not enough ammo. Rico never carried extra. There'd never been a point. There weren't very many reasons you'd ever need more than 12 rounds at .357 mag. Even if he made every hit and it was a kill shot, he was still hosed. He wasn't giving up, though. This was his home, and his little buddies were counting on him. The drone was able to get out in front a bit, and Rico popped both road flares and lit the paper towels. The drone cleared with the murderous insects mere seconds behind. Rico jumped as high as he could and crouched into a ball as he hit his plank, connected to all of those little catapults. 6 bottles launched directly into the swarm and exploded, killing thousands, maybe more. It was barely a scratch, though, and the flies advanced, completely unfazed. Barely a scratch in their numbers. 15 figures walking nonchalantly towards Rico's farmstead, as if the end was already inevitable. Rico retreated back to his homestead as the drone met him at the door in a defensive stance. He had programmed the drone that once its manual routine was over, it was able to defend the house at all costs, so no flies could get in. Out he brought a pressurized pesticide spray bottle full of paint thinner and attached the road flare to the nozzle. The flies would have to bypass the maze of muncher plants to get to him, but he knew they would. There were millions, and he was ready. As the wave hit and got dispersed, each plant was eating hundreds per gulp. Instead of digesting, some simply spit them out, killing hundreds more. Others released clouds that killed thousands, but weren't quite as fast as the spitters. Some sucked them up in the hundreds like bottomless pit vacuum cleaners. The biggest ones were jumping around with their pots still attached, eating and chomping as slime drooled everywhere. Any that got too close to the house, past his plants, Rico would flamethrower them as the drone chopped any that got behind him into soup. His biggest plant, Carnegie Sada, was eating with both heads as fast as it could go, and it kept getting bigger and bigger. Rico couldn't hardly see it being covered in flies, but he could see its silhouette, and it was getting huge. The sun finally caught up to the homestead, and all of the plants seemed to grow in size, at least another 30% in size. Rico burned and charred thousands of bugs before he ran out of fuel, so he did the next best thing he could think of. He ran into the house as his drone guarded the door, splatting bugs as much as it could, but it was running low on power. He came back out with a garden hose and began running around spraying the plants with the water from underground. Rico got stung when he ran out into the garden to water his plants, but there was no choice. His arm blistered but didn't get inflamed. Most of the flies were attracted to the plants to their doom. Rico watered as many as his hose would reach, finally getting to Carnage asada, which was covered in flies. He sprayed water in, hoping to give his favorite plant some relief, only to hear a roar. Before Rico had a chance to reflect on the fact that a two-headed monster plant was roaring, it burst from its pot and began devouring insects by the tens of thousands. Spores on its back were attracting all the bugs to it, and the two heads were able to cover each other. 10 munches and 20 munches later, the flies were starting to thin out. The plants were nearing exhaustion. Carnage asada was low to the ground with a tentacle-like root tail to counterbalance its two huge bulbous heads. The sun supercharged the plant, and at this rate the flies would all be gone soon. Then the shots rang out. Rico's prized plant monster took 3 direct shots, and one head shrieked in pain as the other looked to see what had stung it. Its thick plant armor too dense for the flies to hurt it. 3 more shots and Carnage asada was leaking plant juices from all over. Rico waved Carnage asada away to go hide, and it slunk off, dragging parts of itself behind in a trail of plant juice. Through the fog of war, Rico read the battlefield well. One of the assailants had a hand cannon. Rico shot him dead in the blink of an eye before he had a chance to think. The cannoneer went down, and 14 remained, charging at Rico. With expert aim, 11 more dropped as Rico flipped his hot pistols around to use as clubs and dropped into a defensive stance. The barrels burned his hands, but through the last few weeks he was all too used to pain. The leader, somehow only wounded from a direct hit from a .357 round, backed up into the distance and became obscured from Rico's vision. Only 2 left, one with a club and one with a spear. Thankfully, Rico had nailed the ones with bows and arrows first, although it wasn't precisely intentional, but it worked out well. Rico knew the spearman would get him no problem, not that the club would be a picnic either. He pivoted to keep the clubman in between him and the spearman. Eventually, Rico was able to backpedal until he got close to his plants, to one specific plant. He kept them distracted until they got too close to Sucky. Sucky latched onto his arm and was so strong it completely sucked the skin off his arm. He shrieked in pain and turned his attention to Sucky in order to club the plant to death. The distraction worked, and Rico lunged at him, smashing his head in with the butts of his 2 pistols. The spearman was on him in mere seconds, though, nearly running him through with the spear before Rico was able to roll out of safety. The trick wouldn't work twice, and they both knew it. Rico was out of options, so he tried to talk to the spearman, but no matter what Rico said as he backpedaled, the spearman wouldn't speak. He seemed to be here for one reason and one reason only: kill Rico and end the life of the plants. As Rico's back bumped against the back of the door, he knew it was over. He had debated trying to throw the 2 pistols at the spearman, but then he would have been even more defenseless. The spearman seemed insanely fast as well as ageless. Rico puffed his chest up and jumped into his defensive stance again. The spearman lunged to seamlessly finish Rico off in one thrust when Rico's drone came out of nowhere and shredded the spearman's face. Without thinking, Rico cleared the few steps forward, and with a few smashes, the spearman was no more. Rico gasped to draw his breath, stung everywhere. And looked up. The masked man was back, and he had over 30 friends with him. They all had clubs, and some were picking up the bows and arrows off the fallen warriors that had come before them. Rico took the spear, tossed it up a few times, then threw it as far as he could in an arc. The spear landed feet away from the group as they stood outside the garden perimeter, his plants finishing up the last of the flies. "You cross that spear and you all end up like your pals here. I suggest you leave in peace." Rico said it with all the confidence he could muster. Whether it was true or not, he wouldn't die cowering or hiding. The leader looked at his group of warriors as if it was a joke. They all laughed a snarling laugh, as if this was some kind of inside joke. That's when Rico heard another engine. This was a familiar engine, though. Not the engine sound of hundreds of thousands of flies, but the engine of friends. The attackers advanced past the spear, stuck in the ground defiantly, as a van flew around the side. of the yard and plowed into the group. 8 huge guys piled out and proceeded to beat the living tar out of the marauders like it was simply another day. Rico rushed in to help. The entire fight lasted not even 30 seconds. Rico slumped down laughing, so happy to be with his friends. The plants all danced happily at their victory, bug, guts, slime, and carcasses everywhere. One of the guys pulled Rico up and embraced him with a big hug. "I'm so happy to see you, buddy. We've been cut off due to those damn bugs. They destroyed all the radios in the area, and we haven't been able to get close enough to signal you. Every time we went to go fix them, the bugs chased us off. You're here now, and that's all that matters." Chapter 24, Revelations 2. They all hugged and shook hands and had tea. Rico explained to them all the different sorts of plants and what they did. They helped him bury all the bodies, including the skeleton from the cliff. All of his friends got a plant to take home with them, and they promised to visit more often. Carnasia Sada was fine and went back to live in the cliff wall to overlook the valley, in case the bugs ever came back. Rico went to visit sometimes. He slept in the big dirt pile inside the cliff. The mail started coming in again on a normal schedule. There was a final letter from Joe, something about how there was an online store wish list on a dead man's switch tied to a huge insurance payout. If Joe was ever to die, whoever inherited the homestead would have everything Joe always wanted to get the place going again. Rico considered it his honor to keep Joe's legacy alive. The note came with a huge turbine and all kinds of other homesteading equipment to keep Rico taken care of for a long time. Rico's favorite was reloading equipment and tons of material to make more 357 ammo. Rico's head stopped hurting and he stopped trying to figure out the past and was able to focus on the future. The animals eventually came back along with the plants, and it was a prosperous valley once again. Rico's friends never talked to him about the truck crash, and he lived unhappily until the end of days with his drone and plants. And that is the end of Book 14. So I hope you enjoyed it. Bye-bye.